Take a deep breath. Let the day slowly fall behind you. You've made it this far, and now it's time to drift backward into history. Not the kind filled with grand battles or royal intrigue, but something quieter, something more grounded. Tonight, you're going to ease into the daily rhythms of a time long past. A time when bread wasn't just food, it was life. It could spark riots. It could feed a city or collapse an empire. It was warm, heavy, coarse, and everywhere. Chapter 1. Waking before the bells to bake in the dark. Imagine yourself in a narrow, slanted room tucked above a tiny stone bakery near the Rue Saint Antoine, in the heart of medieval Paris. The air inside is thick with soot. Your eyelids twitch, heavy with fatigue, but the sound of nothing, the stillness before the bells ring, means it's already late. You must rise now, not when the city stirs, but before it even dreams of stirring. There's no window glass to keep out the chill, just thin wooden shutters that rattle with each gust of wind. The straw mattress beneath you crunches faintly as you roll to your side. Your fingers fumble for a candle stub and flint sparks hiss as they meet steel. A reluctant flame glows to life. It flickers in the draft like it resents being woken to. There is no real morning in a baker's world, just darkness and duty. By the time the church bells toll their first low notes across the Seine, your dough should already be resting. But that only happens if the fire is lit, the flour is sifted, the water is hauled, and the dough is mixed, each action a small battle in a much larger war between man and nature. You climb down the ladder to the bakery below, joints aching though you're not even 30. You were born into this life, apprenticed as a boy, kneaded into the very rhythm of the oven's breath. There's a quiet truth in the fact that bakers rarely live long. The heat scorches not just the skin, but the lungs, the bones, the soul. But bread is everything. And so you go on. The oven itself looms in the darkness, a stone maw you must wake from slumber. It doesn't roar to life like a modern machine. First, you carry in damp bundles of firewood stacked beside the soot-slick walls, each log still wet from the sand mist. You pile them carefully, methodically, building a small cave of sticks within the curved belly of the oven. Then comes the slow coaxing flame to ember to blaze. Your clothes reek of smoke before you've even begun your first loaf. Your hands, already cracked and calloused, blackened again with ash, and it is still not yet dawn. There's no yeast as you know it today. No neat packets, no measured grams. What you have is a living culture, your leaven, a bubbling slurry of flour and water kept alive like a pet. It's temperamental. On good days, it frosts and rises with a quiet strength. On bad days, it sours into something foul or simply dies, leaving you with flat, heavy loaves and the risk of a fine from the guild. The rules are strict. You cannot sell underweight bread. You cannot burn the king's flour ration. You cannot sleep through your shift. And yet, you're exhausted. Always. This morning, your leaven is sluggish. The cold has slowed its fermentation. You consider cheating, adding a pinch of old ale to wake it, but if the guild inspector visits and he tastes it, there could be trouble. You press your palms into the flour-dusted table and begin kneading anyway. The rhythm is familiar. Push, fold, turn. The dough is heavier than it should be. Your shoulders ache. A cough builds in your chest, but you stifle it. There's no time for weakness. Outside, a cart clatters over uneven cobblestones, its driver whistling. The city hasn't woken, but the noise begins. In the faint candlelight, your flour stores look thin. You were supposed to receive a new sack yesterday, but the delivery never came. Was it stolen? Spoiled? Sold off by the miller to a higher bidder? You'll never know. All that matters is what you have today, barely enough to meet your quota. You measure carefully, more careful than a priest counting coins. If a single loaf falls short in weight, a customer might report you. If too many do, you'll be summoned before the magistrate. If you're found cheating the scales, the punishments are designed not just to shame you, but to warn others. Your fingers sting with cold. Your knees ache. The dough rises slowly. As you wait, you grind salt against a stone, then mix it into the second batch. You don't taste your bread. That's for the customers. You only smell it, the scent of hope and exhaustion mingling in the air. The fire pops behind you. The oven groans. You lean your forehead against the wall, the stone cool against your skin. Just a moment of rest, but not too long. The loaves must be shaped. Shaping is an art passed down through generations. Each baker has a signature touch, a way they twist, score, or mark their bread. It's not about creativity, it's identification. If bread goes bad or is found wanting, the mark tells the inspector who made it. You shape quickly, efficiently. Rounds for the working class, long loaves for the burghers, fine white rolls, reserved for wealthier customers. A special order flour from the Royal Grain Store must be made precisely as dictated. Any mistake, and the baker could be banned from touching the king's supply again. That's not just a punishment. It's a death sentence for your business. The sun is still hidden when you slide the first loaves into the oven. There's no timer, no thermostat. You learn the oven by sound, by smell, by instinct. Too hot and the crust blacken before the insides bake. Too cool and the bread will sag, heavy and doughy. You wait, eyes watching the color of the flame, ears tuned to the crackle of wood. The smoke leaks into your skin. The soot clings to your hair. When you pull the first loaves out, you feel their weight in your arms like newborns. Heavy, dense, steaming. You stack them in baskets lined with coarse cloth. Then you start again. The bakery door opens and the first customer steps in. A housemaid, wrapped in shawls, holding a copper coin and a cracked leather glove. She doesn't speak, just nods and points. You pass her a loaf. She sniffs it, satisfied. She leaves. More follow. A line forms before the sky even turns gray. No one thanks you. They simply pay and move along. Bread isn't luxury. It's survival. And if your loaves aren't good enough, they'll go elsewhere. Or worse, they'll complain. And a complaint carries weight. A baker who draws too many complaints might be publicly shamed, or fined, or banned. Behind you, the oven crackles again. You turn back to the work. There are still 5 batches to go before midday. Still ashes to shovel. Still sacks to haul. Still bills to settle. And somewhere far above your station, nobles and clerics dine on pastries and spiced loaves you'll never even taste. But you go on, because in this city, in this age, the baker's fire is never allowed to die. It is a quiet, relentless burden, and it begins before the bells every single day. The line outside your door eventually thins, but the pressure never does. The baskets you filled so carefully this morning are now mostly empty, and the heat from the oven has started to fade. That means it's time to rake out the ashes and start the next round. Your tunic is soaked through with sweat, but the cold outside seeps into the stone floor, chilling your ankles and drying your knuckles to cracked leather. You lift the iron peel again, its long wooden handle warm from constant use, and begin sliding the blackened debris into a pail. Your back tightens as you do. There's no comfortable way to work with an oven that's shoulder high, no matter how many years you've done it. Midday arrives with little ceremony. The bells echo across the rooftops, calling people to their noon meal. You do not stop for years. There's no dedicated break in a baker's routine. You chew a crust torn from a burned loaf as you work. It's stale from yesterday and hard enough to grind your teeth. But it's calories, and you'll need them. The city is growing restless outside. You hear a dog barking. A pair of children squabble over something small and round. You wonder if it's one of your rolls, dropped and dirty, but still worth fighting over. Bread isn't just food in Paris, it's a measure of safety, a measure of how close you are to hunger. And hunger in this city can turn people violent. A knock at the back door makes your stomach tighten. That's not a customer. That's the flower agent come to collect on the delivery you haven't yet paid for. You wipe your hands on your apron and open the door slowly. He doesn't say much. He doesn't need to. You explain that the flower shipment was short, that you were promised more yesterday, that it never arrived. He nods not because he believes you, but because he's heard it all before. He makes a small note on a wax tablet and leaves. You know what that means. If the shortage continues, you'll be reported to the guild. If they find that you've sold full loaves made from underweight flour, they'll inspect your scale. And if they find that you've adjusted the weights, as so many desperate bakers do, you will be fined or worse. Your heart thuds in your chest, not with fear exactly, but with the dread of inevitability. This job offers no safety net. If you fall, you hit stone. The second round of baking begins with tired hands. This dough is different. It's meant for a wealthier client, a local tavern that serves visiting merchants and minor nobles. They've asked for softer crust and finer texture. That means sieving the flour twice, adding more water, adjusting the bake time. You hate doing it. Not because the bread is hard, but because the tavern pays late. Always a promise of coin tomorrow, never today. But you can't afford to say no. Refuse an order, and word gets around. Soon you'll be seen as unreliable. Unreliable bakers don't last. As the dough rises, you glance toward the corner where your apprentice usually stands, but he's not here. He was supposed to be chopping wood. Your brow furrows. The boy is 12 and quick with excuses. You don't blame him for sneaking off now and then, but today is not the day for it. Wood is low. Flour is low. Temper is low. You'll have to find him before nightfall. Not to scold him. Maybe a little, but because without help, tomorrow will be worse. Another knock comes, this one faster. You open the front door and find a city inspector, black robe, badge stitched to his sleeve, hands already reaching for your scales. No words of greeting, just business. You step aside and watch as he tests your balance with a set of bronze weights. Your palms feel damp despite the cold. He sniffs one of your loaves. He marks a tally. He leaves. Nothing said. No expression. That's better than the alternative. Still, the knot in your stomach remains. Even a neutral visit from the inspector is a reminder of how thin the ice beneath your feet has become. You slide the tavern loaves into the oven and turn to face the growing stack of chores. There's the leaven to refresh, the boards to scrub, the floor to sweep, and sacks to shift from the back alley into the storeroom before damp sets in. But just as you reach for a broom, the church bell tolls again late afternoon already. Time folds oddly in this place. It stretches in the silence of early dawn and collapses once the city awakens. A group of neighborhood boys dart past your doorway, one holding a loaf high above his head like a trophy. Another chases laughing. You sigh. They've likely stolen it from another vendor, or worse, taken it from someone smaller. But you don't have time to interfere. You barely have time to think. Evening draws near, and with it comes the final batch of dough. It's coarser, less refined, meant for laborers who come at dusk, hoping for a discounted price. You roll it out with less care, not because they don't matter, but because they won't notice or complain. As long as it's warm and heavy, they'll take it. You shape the round quickly, scoring them with a simple cross. As they rest, you start tidying the workspace. Ashes raked. Flour bins covered. Boards rinsed with vinegar. A silence settles over the shop again. Outside, footsteps echo against stone. Horses clot past, pulling carts toward the market square. A baby cries in the distance, then stops. Your apprentice finally returns, breathless, holding a bundle of kindling. You don't speak, just gesture toward the firebox. He nods, head low, and goes to work. He's small, all elbows and knees, but his hands are quick and sure. You see yourself in him and not in a sentimental way. Just the shape of inevitability. If he lasts, he'll be you in 10 years. If he doesn't, he'll vanish like the others did. The alley behind your bakery has claimed more than one runaway apprentice, lost to cold, hunger, or the lure of easier coin. You don't ask where he went. You don't want to know. The tavern boy arrives just as the final loaves cool. He wears a vest too big for him and speaks with the authority of someone mimicking a master. You hand him the warm rolls wrapped in linen. He doesn't thank you, but neither do you expect him to. His payment is not in coin, just a note promising silver by a week's end. You know better than to believe it. Still, you accept the paper and file it beside the others. The day is nearly over, but not quite. You take one last moment to yourself, standing in the center of your small bakery, surrounded by the scent of yeast and wood smoke, ash and sweat. The heat has died down. Your legs ache, your back burns, but for now, the shelves are full again. The door is bolted, and the fire, at last, is allowed to rest. You climb the ladder slowly, joints stiff with repetition. In your loft, the candle has burned low. The shutters rattle once more. You lower yourself onto the straw mattress, and for a brief moment before tomorrow begins, you allow yourself to forget how much it hurts to wake up before the bells. Chapter 2. The bread riots of 13th century Paris. The first signs of unrest were not loud. They rarely were. In Paris, during the early 1200s, unease crept in like a winter fog, quiet, persistent, and difficult to ignore. All it took was a whisper, a glance, the wrong man standing near a scale with too many complaints behind him. And when the tension finally snapped, it rarely started in a grand way. It was hunger, humiliation, and helplessness erupting into chaos. A man knocked over a stall. A woman screamed at a baker, calling him a thief. Someone threw a stone, then another. Barrels were overturned. Bakers caught skimming flour or hiding loaves for private clients were fined, shamed, sometimes even jailed. It was a fragile, uneven supply chain built on the backs of farmers struggling under taxes, millers often accused of corruption. One particularly infamous riot, recorded in the year 1240, saw several bakeries along the Rue des Lombards destroyed after word spread that a group of guild bakers had conspired to hide their finest loaves from public sale. Witnesses described the crowd as a river of arms and shouting mouths, spilling into shops and dragging bread into the street. One baker reportedly tried to douse the mob with buckets of water from his well. It only enraged them further. They broke down his oven door and tossed loaves into the Seine, declaring them unfit for dogs. Most were not villains, just tired craftsmen trying to survive in a world that demanded too much. Their ovens were hot, their margins thin, their reputation always at risk. And when the loaves ran low, the cost was not just paid in coin, but in bruises, broken windows, and nights spent watching the door. He survived, barely, and left the city within a month. And merchants who hoarded grain during shortages to sell at inflated prices. The decree was written in stiff, formal Latin, but its message was clear: provide fair bread or suffer public disgrace. Yet even royal edicts could not solve the deeper issue: flour scarcity. When grain prices soared, even honest bakers could not afford enough to meet demand. And if they raised prices, even by a fraction, The consequences were immediate and brutal. And when a bad harvest came, as it often did in the 13th century, there simply wasn't enough to go around. A few even sold only to pre-selected clients, bypassing the public altogether. Like a thunderstorm after a drought, the guild even developed a quiet protocol for handling the aftermath. Guild leaders would tour damaged bakeries, offer token reparations, and remind members of the rules. A few sacrificial punishments would be handed down to appease the public. The streets would be swept. Prices, briefly, would stabilize. But everyone knew it was temporary. The bread had to last. The people had to eat. And when both became uncertain again, the sparks would return. But this only deepened resentment. The people saw these measures not as protection, but as proof of guilt. And so the cycle continued. Shortage bred suspicion. Suspicion bred anger. Anger erupted into violence. Then came inspection, punishment, shame, and silence, until the next bad harvest. The rich, as always, were insulated. They could afford white loaves made from fine sifted flour, baked in private kitchens or by high-ranking guild members who never touched the market. But the poor depended on daily bread sold from street-side ovens in narrow storefronts. And when those loaves shrank or disappeared, the line between civil order and bread riot thinned to the width of a crust. Those who failed repeatedly could lose their right to bake altogether. And for the baker, that wasn't just a loss of profession. It was exile from a trade that had shaped his entire life. Flour burst into the air like smoke from a fire. The baker tried to protest. Perhaps he even was innocent. But it didn't matter. His apron marked him. His trade condemned him. The crowd surged forward, not to kill, not usually, but to punish. They struck him with fists, with ladles, with shoes. They dragged him through the market square and left him bruised and broken near the well. His stall was stripped, his bread stolen, his scale shattered. Perhaps it was a mother who found the center of her loaf hollow, crust cracked and brittle. The people scattered, many fading into alleyways or slipping across bridges before questions could be asked. But even if caught, few would have been punished severely. The magistrates understood too well hunger, made people dangerous. Starved the city, and the people turned savage. So the authorities focused their attention not on the rioters, but on the bakers. They sent inspectors into ovens and storerooms. They weighed loaves. They summoned guild masters to testify. And the guild, anxious to preserve its reputation, handed out punishments quickly and publicly. Perhaps it was an apprentice boy selling bread for 1 denier more than usual. Or maybe it was a rumor untraceable, vague, but insistent that bakers had begun to sell bread made with adulterated flour, that they were hiding good loaves behind the counter for higher-paying customers, that the common people were being starved while the guild masters lived in comfort. It lingered in the baker's quarter, where flour shipments began arriving late, or not at all. Beneath the creaking wooden beams and damp stone floor, fishmongers yelled beside cheesemakers. Cloth merchants argued with butchers. But it was always the bread stalls that held the most attention. On certain mornings, as tensions rose, customers pressed close to the stalls, not to purchase, but to scrutinize. They picked up loaves and weighed them in their hands. They broke them open to examine the crumb. They demanded scales be used in front of them. And when one vendor refused, or when a scale tilted suspiciously, the mood changed. The chatter stopped. The crowd grew silent. Then someone shouted. It sat in the silence of empty grain sacks, in the suspicious glances shared between neighbors, in the slight dip in the weight of a loaf. For the working poor of the city, bread was not just sustenance. It was everything. If the loaf on your table grew smaller, it meant something else had gone wrong. Maybe the miller was hoarding grain. Maybe the guilds had raised prices. Maybe the baker had started skimming flour to make ends meet. But in the minds of many, one thing was certain. Someone was to blame. It is hard to imagine today, but a baker's reputation in medieval Paris could crumble in an afternoon. The riots began in the markets. They always did. La Halle, the great covered market at the center of the city, was where Parisians of all classes mingled, albeit uncomfortably. The violence that followed was never organized. It wasn't led by revolutionary ideals or planned revolt. By the time the city watch arrived, the damage was done. The market reeked of spilled sourdough and trampled feet. The rules became stricter. Bread had to be sold at regulated prices. Loaves had to meet a set weight. Guild-certified marks were burned onto the crust. But none of this stopped the unrest. Because the root of the problem wasn't dishonest bakers. City records from the period mention numerous disturbances. In response, King Louis IX issued a royal edict reminding bakers of their duty to the city and the consequences of betrayal. Some bakers tried to protect themselves. They hired guards. They built heavier shutters. They moved their operations out of view. The riots were not constant, but they were expected. For the bakers, it was a helpless position. They were both providers and scapegoats, entrusted with feeding the city, but blamed when the system failed. When the riots subsided, they left behind more than shattered stalls and empty baskets. The real damage settled in the minds of those who remained bakers who continued working beneath a constant haze of suspicion. Even those untouched by the violence knew it could just as easily have been them. The wrong price on a loaf, the wrong look from a customer, or a single whisper about hoarding could light the fuse again. They listened for the tone of market voices, for the shift from barter to blame. A few mixed ground beans or spoiled flour into their dough, hoping to stretch their goods without detection. Others kept back a loaf or two each day for private clients, slipping them through side doors in exchange for extra coin. These bakers lived dangerously, and they knew it. One complaint could undo them. But they also knew that survival sometimes required bending rules. It was no longer just a staple. It became a symbol, a gauge of justice or injustice. Political pamphlets began to mention it. Priests spoke of it in sermons. Bread was held up as the ultimate right of the poor and the ultimate responsibility of the state. Never sell the last loaf too late in the day, one would say. Don't let them see your second sack of flour. Keep one door open, one closed. These were not rules from a book, but wisdom earned through survival. And survival, in the end, was the only real goal. Feed enough, anger few, and live to bake another day. What is the point of heaven, one preacher reportedly said, if the people starve in the shadow of the cathedral? And while the sermon stirred pity in some, they stirred something else in others, resentment, anger, conviction. The system they were in did not reward honesty. It rewarded results loaves on the shelf, coin in the box, peace in the streets. Bakers were required to hang small wooden plaques outside their shops, listing the day's prices. Inspectors visited more frequently. Penalties increased. Some bakeries, particularly in wealthy neighborhoods, were required to give away a fixed number of loaves per week to the poor, a policy known as bread alms. These loaves were often coarse and dry, made from the remnants of better doughs, but for those in need they made a difference. And the city, as it always did, moved on. But beneath the crust of daily life, the tension remained, waiting, watching. And in the mind of every baker, whether in a bustling guild hall or a tiny back alley oven, was the same unspoken fear. When would the next riot begin? And would it be their door the crowd knocked on next? The bread line became a daily ritual humbling, sometimes humiliating, but necessary. And if a corner had to be cut to make that happen, so be it. Because in truth, no rule could prevent a bad harvest. No law could make a hungry man wait patiently. No decree could stop a mother from striking a baker if she believed her children were starving. Hunger does not listen to logic. And so Paris endured the cycle again and again. Calm, shortage, tension, eruption, repeat. They knew which alleyways to slip down, which corners to avoid. Some became runners for their families, sent out with a single coin and strict instructions. Get whatever you can, and don't stop if they're shouting. A few, especially the older ones, learned to scavenge. They hovered near bakeries at closing time, hoping for stale rolls tossed out with the ash and soot. Some shopkeepers, sympathetic but too afraid to give openly, left scraps on window ledges or beside well-silent offerings to avoid confrontation. So they worked more carefully, they kept receipts, weighed obsessively, and tried to maintain appearances. But deep down, everyone knew that fairness was only part of survival. Conspiracy theories spread like wildfire. Some believed that certain millers and bakers worked together to control the flow of grain, hoarding it until prices rose. The buildings remained quiet, soot-stained, and boarded over, but the people moved on, forced into other trades or out of the city entirely. Those who remained grew warier. The shutters stayed bolted longer. Conversations grew shorter. Smiles vanished. Even the smell of fresh bread, once a comfort, became tinged with tension. A good loaf meant someone had flour. And if you didn't, you wondered why? Others whispered that royal agents paid bakers to make inferior bread for the poor, to weaken them and keep them docile. None of this was ever proven, but belief didn't require proof, just hunger. And in the hollow stomachs of a city with too many mouths and too few loaves, belief turned quickly into action. The rest depended on timing, luck, and the mood of the crowd. And in a city like Paris, where the poor often outnumbered the well-fed, the mood could shift quickly. Within the guild, there were murmurs. Some called for stricter punishment of rioters, demanding the city watch take a harder stance. Others begged for leniency from the crown requests for grain subsidies, price adjustments, or emergency stores to be opened. People began buying in pairs, forming small coalitions to inspect loaves together, or track which stalls sold the most consistent bread. Some women baked at home, despite the laws forbidding unlicensed bread sales. In times of scarcity, housewives traded root vegetables or scraps of cloth for half loaves, or bought coarse black bread made with husks and lentil flour. This bread, often bitter and heavy, was rarely filling, but it stretched. And when your stomach grumbled and your purse was empty, stretching became the goal. Most pleas fell into silence. The crown was busy with its own concerns, taxes, wars, and the needs of nobility. Hunger among commoners was viewed as regrettable but expected, a seasonal part of life. Even Louis IX, known for his justice and piety, rarely intervened directly unless the riots threatened royal property or interrupted trade. For most bakers, help never arrived. They relied instead on each other, on whispered warnings passed through alleyways, on shared sacks of flour, or guild elders who had seen worse and knew how to ride out the chaos. Outside the guild walls, the city adjusted in quieter ways. Children grew up learning the signs of a brewing riot. The baker's trade became a balancing act, not just of flour and water, but of loyalty and deception. Some did cheat, it's true. Meanwhile, rumors continued to grow in the dark corners of Paris. Some bakeries closed altogether. Small independent ovens, unable to afford guild fees or protection, shut their doors and vanished. Eventually, the riots changed the way Paris thought about bread. In response, the city took subtle measures. And yet, even with reforms, riots still flared. The bakers knew the pattern. They baked through it. They absorbed it. Some even passed down riot stories like recipes, lessons etched in bruises and broken tools. So the fires were lit again each morning. The dough was kneaded. The bread was shaped, marked, and sold. Chapter 3: Mystery of the Black Bread Tax. If white bread was the dream, black bread was the reality. In medieval Paris, the color of your loaf told a story before a word was ever spoken. For the city's poor laborers, washerwomen, apprentices, and servants, black bread was not a choice. It was what they could afford. Dense, sour, and coarse, it was made from a mix of rye, barley, and whatever other grains could be milled into something vaguely edible. Its crust was hard, its crumb uneven. It sat like stone in the belly and turned stale in a day. But it filled the gaps hunger left behind, and for most Parisians, that was enough. What they didn't expect, what still confounds many historians today, was to be taxed for eating it. The so-called black bread tax didn't appear overnight. It emerged slowly, folded into broader levies on grain and flour, wrapped in the kind of bureaucratic language that made it difficult to question. It wasn't even referred to by that name in official ledgers. Instead, it came disguised tariffs on low-grade rye, restrictions on milling outside guild oversight, added tolls on coarse flour brought into the city. But the effect was unmistakable. The darker your bread, the more taxes had touched it. And the more taxes touched it, the more it cost, ironically burdening the poorest with the highest relative costs for the lowest quality food. The origins of the tax are murky, as many medieval policies were. It likely began as a levy on non-guild flour. The Bakers' Guild, seeking to control quality and pricing, petitioned the city to penalize unlicensed millers and sellers. They framed it as a public safety measure. Coarse bread, they warned, could harbor illness or spoil faster. And there was some truth to these concerns. The policy also conveniently pressured citizens into buying from guild-approved sources. This kept money within the established hierarchy, while making it harder for rural sellers to compete in city markets. Farmers who brought in sacks of rye or spelt found themselves paying tolls at the gates, then again at the weighhouse, and sometimes once more when exchanging coin. Those costs filtered down, and by the time a loaf of dark bread reached a kitchen table in a one-room flat near the Seine, its price was often just pennies below that of a white loaf, a loaf still out of reach. There was something bitterly poetic about taxing the poor for being poor. It wasn't stated outright, but everyone understood. You ate black bread, not because you wanted to, but because you had to, and now you paid for the shame. In wealthier circles, white bread was seen as a marker of refinement. Soft, fine-milled, snow-colored. It sat on silver platters beside spiced meat and sweet wines. In poorer homes, black bread arrived wrapped in cloth, torn with bare hands, and dipped in thin broth. It was a daily reminder of your station, and the tax only deepened the divide. Some tried to resist. Housewives formed quiet cooperatives, pooling what little money they had to buy flour directly from sympathetic millers on the outskirts. But even then, they faced the tolls at the city gates. A sack too large would draw attention. A woman caught smuggling unapproved flour could be fined or, worse, summoned before the magistrate. There are records of such cases buried in the dusty court books of 13th century Paris. One woman, Marguerite of Saint Martin, was charged with selling illicit bread from her window. Her defense was simple. She couldn't afford the guild loaves. Her neighbors supported her, signing with shaking hands, but the judgment stood. A fine was imposed, equivalent to 2 weeks of wages. She paid it in installments at least, until the records lose track of her. The tax also had an unintended consequence. It gave rise to a new class of underground bakers. These were not rebels in the romantic sense. They were desperate men and women with small ovens in their cellars or behind shuttered doors. They baked at night, sold at dawn, and vanished by midday. Their bread was rough, sometimes undercooked, often uneven, but it was cheaper. And for those scraping by, it was enough. They risked the rest, of course. City inspectors roamed the streets with sharp eyes and quick hands, lifting cloth from baskets, cracking loaves in half, questioning buyers. But the underground market persisted, because for many, paying the official price wasn't an option. Not when rent was due, not when a child was sick, not when wages came late, or not at all. There were other pressures too. The church, while often sympathetic to the poor, sometimes enforced fasting days that complicated things further. On certain holy days, eating white bread was considered indulgent. But the black bread tax didn't pause for saints. So you found yourself navigating both spiritual guilt and economic punishment, forced to eat the loaf you could afford, even if it conflicted with your faith. Some parish priests looked the other way. Others preached fire and brimstone. For the commoner, it was another line to walk, another burden to carry in silence. Interestingly, not all dark bread was seen as shameful. Among scholars and monks, certain rye loaves were prized for their rustic simplicity. In abbeys and monasteries where simplicity was considered virtuous, black bread became part of the daily diet. But this was different. These loaves were blessed, part of a spiritual discipline. They were baked with care, consumed in silence, accompanied by scripture and wine. To the layperson, black bread came with none of that dignity. It was a necessity, not a choice, a sign of hardship, not piety. Over time, resentment toward the tax grew, even if you dared to speak it aloud. It became a quiet bitterness, passed from mother to daughter, whispered in alleys and behind doors. The tax was never officially repealed. Instead, it simply faded as the city's economy shifted. New trade routes brought better grain. Famine years came and went. The guild lost some of its grip, but the memory remained. And in stories told decades later, old women still warned of the loaf that cost twice and fed half. Today, when historians study the economic policies of medieval Paris, they often glance past the black bread tax as a footnote. But for those who lived under it, it was no small thing. It was a daily reminder that justice was measured in coin, and that hunger did not exempt you from bureaucracy. In a world where bread was life, even the crumbs were taxed, and still they baked. Still they fed their children. Still they survived. Not with pride, perhaps, but with endurance. The kind that leaves no monuments but carries through generations in silence, in memory, in the dark crust of a humble loaf. As the decades passed and the population of Paris swelled within its stone walls, the pressure on its grain system only grew. The average citizen, already burdened by the invisible weight of taxes stitched into every bite of black bread, began to adapt in subtle, often desperate ways. If they used too much fine flour, they were accused of hoarding or passing off white bread at black bread prices. Customers would sometimes demand the baker slice the loaf in half on the spot to prove its quality, holding the crumb up to the light to judge its color and texture. The city required tolls at nearly every gate, fees at every weighing station, and additional payments for non-guild goods entering the central markets. If a rural miller wished to deliver black flour to the left bank, he might pay 3 different charges before ever setting foot in a baker's shop. And these charges did not vanish with time. They passed through the chain into the dough, into the oven, into the hands of the poor. Inspectors continued their rounds, measuring loaves against metal standards, sniffing for illegal additives, weighing with scales that may or may not have been truly fair, not of money but of faces, who came hungry too many times, who lied about what they could pay, who offered favors in place of coin. It was not a list kept for punishment, but for memory. Trade expanded. Grain grew more accessible, and the guilds faced slow but inevitable reform. But the legacy of that time lingered. For generations afterward, the phrase bread tax carried weight, even when the tax itself no longer did. It was used to describe anything unjust, anything heavy and cruel that targeted those already low. And in stories told at hearths or in hushed tones across market stalls, black bread remained a symbol, not of failure, but of persistence, for control. In a business where margins were thin and empathy could be costly, knowing who would return tomorrow was a form of power. And sometimes, when a child arrived with eyes wide and palms open, a baker who had sworn never to give charity again reached beneath the counter and passed over a stale crust. Because he remembered, because he had once been that child. And bakers, exhausted by both the scrutiny and the expectations, learned to protect themselves. Nobles and wealthy merchants rarely set foot in the bakeries that sold black bread. Their kitchens employed personal bakers. Their grain came from private mills. They endured. They stretched their loaves. They baked in secret. They fed their children. And when inspectors passed, they smiled thinly and held their tongues. It was not surrender. It was survival. And in that survival, there was quiet defiance, rising like yeast in the dark corners of every stone oven. They dined on brioche and almond-laced loaves, untouched by tolls or tariffs. And yet they spoke often of civic order, of how Paris needed its structure, its rules. They saw the grain market only as a number on a parchment. They did not smell the burnt crusts. They did not hear the growl of a hungry stomach echo through the alley at dawn. Some began creating poor batches, deliberately overbaked, drier, more heavily scored to bake quickly and save on firewood. These loaves were technically legal, but undesirable, sold late in the day for a fraction of the price. They kept the desperate from starvation while keeping the inspector's pen dry. But they also deepened the divide one loaf for the guild books, another for survival. You might be a mother holding a single coin, standing at the back of a line, watching the price of the cheapest loaf creep higher while your child tugs at your sleeve with hunger in his eyes. If the bread passed the test, it might be purchased. Though never openly politicized, some citizens began to embrace the coarse loaves, not as symbols of shame, but as badges of endurance. Songs emerged in certain districts, mocking verses about the guild and its inspectors. We eat what's burnt, what's browned, what's taxed, but never beg, went one refrain, hummed over washing or while scrubbing steps. Bread, which had once divided, now became a strange unifier among the poor, a recognition that they all shared the same bitter crust, the same dry ends, the same quiet anger. If not, it was tossed aside with a muttered curse, and the customer moved to another shop. Monasteries organized modest bread kitchens where the line between piety and survival blurred. These loaves were smaller, but untaxed, seen as gifts rather than goods. The church could not feed the city, but it could soften the edge of suffering. And in doing so, it reminded both baker and buyer that the value of bread was more than just economic. It was symbolic, sacred. For bakers trying to maintain a livelihood, it became a daily dance of cautious compromise. How dark could the bread be before it was accused of fraud? How light could it be before someone questioned the source of the flour? They watered down their stews to stretch their slices further. They bartered small household items for loaves when money ran out. And they began to treat their bakers, once seen as neighbors and craftsmen, with cautious distrust. If a loaf was lighter than usual, it wasn't always seen as bad luck, it was interpreted as theft. And theft in a world of scarcity was not forgiven lightly. Bakers found themselves caught in a trap of optics. If they used coarse flour, they were accused of selling substandard bread. And then there were the millers. the unseen hands and the background of the bread economy. Often situated just beyond the city's walls or beside its winding rivers, the millers were responsible for transforming grain into usable flour, but their reputation was uneven. Some were respected men, long established in their community. Others were viewed as cunning manipulators, known for tampering with weights or substituting cheaper grains to inflate profits. When flour was scarce or of poor quality, people rarely blamed the weather. They blamed the miller. Rumors spread of bags of good grain being secretly held in barns until the price rose, or of officials being bribed to overlook irregularities in the flour supply. And while such stories were difficult to prove, they were easy to believe in a time when hunger made suspicion feel like a form of defense. The tax itself, though never straightforward, became increasingly burdensome through its secondary effects. This incremental economic squeeze made black bread something of a quiet rebellion. Within some parishes, clergy began to intervene not with protests, but with charity. Leftover altar bread was increasingly distributed among the needy. Still, the city's bureaucracy remained unmoved. Tax collectors recorded their ledgers without emotion. Behind closed doors, some bakers began recording their own ledgers. Among the elite, the whole affair seemed invisible. Eventually, as new kings rose and old policies faded, the specific taxes tied to black bread softened. Because in the end, the people did not revolt with swords. Chapter 4. A Royal Tasting in the Louvre Kitchens. While most bakers in medieval Paris wrestled with soot's scarcity and suspicion, there was another world one hidden behind stone walls, velvet drapes, and guards with halberds at their sides. This was the world of the royal kitchens inside the old Louvre Palace, long before it became a museum. Here, bread was not just food, it was ceremony, status, and precision. It arrived at the king's table alongside golden goblets and silver platters. Its crust expected to be flawless, its flavor delicate, its texture soft enough to tear without crumbs. And behind each of those loaves was a royal baker, nervous, sweating, and acutely aware that one wrong bite could end a career. The Louvre kitchens were immense by the standards of the time, several rooms deep, with high vaulted ceilings stained from decades of smoke. Massive hearths lined the stone walls, each large enough to roast a whole boar or bake dozens of loaves at once. But for all their size, these kitchens were not peaceful. They hummed with a kind of restrained panic. Dozens of cooks, carvers, stewards, and pastrymen moved through them like dancers in a rigid choreography. Everyone had a station. Everyone had a superior. And above them all, invisible but omnipresent, was the court's expectation. Royal bread had to reflect the dignity of the crown. That meant pure white flour, triple sifted, often milled from grain grown on royal lands and guarded during transit. It was expensive, yes, but the cost wasn't just in coin. It was in scrutiny. Each sack was inspected for stones, insects, even odor. Each measure weighed with almost religious seriousness. And when the flour finally reached the royal baker's hands, there was no room for improvisation. Recipes were followed like scripture. The water was filtered. The salt was ground fine. The kneading had a rhythm measured not in minutes, but in number of folds. The baker himself, usually a man of middle age, trained since adolescence and chosen from the most elite guilds, was both privileged and precarious. He lived within the palace walls in a small chamber near the kitchens, his bed always warm from the nearby ovens. His apron bore no soot. His nails were kept clean. He was paid more than most city bakers, but with pay came pressure. The king might never speak to him directly, but his bread would be tasted by stewards, bishops, and guests from foreign lands. If it was too dense, too bland, or too dry, word would return. And if word returned too many times, he would be replaced. Quietly, without public fuss, his place taken by another baker waiting in the wings. Every few weeks, the king's steward ordered a tasting, a formal inspection of the bread being served at court. These tastings were ritualized, with loaves sliced and presented on silver boards, cut open with ivory-handled knives, the crumb exposed like a rare jewel. The steward would sniff first, then press the interior between his fingers. It was not about flavor alone. It was about structure, the weight, the bounce, the distribution of air. If the bread passed, it was sliced for service. If it failed, it was set aside, sometimes sent to feed the lesser staff, sometimes discarded entirely, and always, the baker was told. Not with cruelty, but with finality. Imagine standing there, watching as your finest loaf, something you kneaded with care in the early hours of morning, baked in a flame-licked oven with steady hands, is split in two, and discarded without a word. You say nothing. You cannot speak. You bow, you nod, and you return to the kneading bench to begin again. Because in this world, perfection was not the goal. It was the minimum requirement. At royal feasts, bread became part of the decor. It was sculpted into intricate shapes, braided crowns, miniature towers, twisted knots resembling heraldic symbols. Some were edible, others not. There are records of decorative loaves made with salt and ash, baked hard to last through the night's events and discarded afterward. These breads were rarely eaten, but they had to be beautiful. The royal baker worked with a team for such displays, painters who dusted the crust with gold leaf, assistants who carved initials into the dough before baking, sculptors who worked in flour and water instead of stone. Still, even amid such spectacle, the risk of failure loomed. During a coronation feast in the mid-1200s, one loaf meant for the Dauphin's table arrived overbaked. Its crust too dark, its scent slightly burnt. It was never served. The baker responsible, whose name is lost to history, was not reprimanded publicly. But he disappeared from the kitchen rolls the following season. His chamber reassigned. His position filled. It was assumed, whispered, that he had been dismissed quietly, allowed to return to his former district under the condition that he never speak of his post. It was not punishment. It was removal. The court preferred its errors erased cleanly, like flour dust from a counter. What made this pressure worse was the knowledge that one could never ascend beyond it. The royal baker, for all his skill and sacrifice, would never be nobility. He would never own land or sit at the table he fed. His hands, capable of feeding kings, would never shake one. His work was respected, but only so far. He lived at the edge of greatness, never inside it. Close enough to see the splendor, but never invited to partake. And yet, despite this, there were moments of pride. When the steward nodded, when a loaf vanished from the platter quickly, when a foreign envoy asked about the technique behind a particularly soft interior. These were victories, quiet and visible, but deeply felt. The baker might allow himself a smile then, a breath of relief. A moment alone in his chamber, sitting beside his oven, rolling his fingers against the worn edge of his bread peel, thinking, I did it. For today, I did it. Meanwhile, outside the palace gates, the city buzzed with its usual struggles. Bakers in St. Marcel were watering their dough to make it stretch. A flour merchant near the temple quarter was arguing with a baker over missing sacks. And mothers, just as they had the day before, clutched coins and hoped the bread would last. It would never taste the loaves served in the Louvre, never see the silver platters or the gold-dusted crusts. But their lives and the life of the royal baker were tied by the same truth. Bread was everything. Whether coarse or fine, taxed or blessed, it sustained the rhythm of the city. Inside the palace kitchens, the fire never went out. Even at midnight, you might hear the gentle thump of dough being shaped. The creak of the oven's iron door, the soft shuffle of leather soles on stone. The royal baker could not rest. Tomorrow's loaves would be judged, just like today's, and in the soft glow of the hearth, as shadows flickered against the high walls, he worked silently, his hands steady, his breath calm, and his heart carrying the quiet, constant weight of perfection. Not every loaf baked in the royal kitchens was meant for the king's table. Behind the ceremonial tastings and glittering platters was a quieter system one that fed the palace staff. The guards who paced the courtyards, the scribes bent over scrolls in candlelit chambers, and the washerwomen who toiled by the river. These loaves were simpler, still made with quality flour, but lacking the artistry and attention reserved for the royal family. And yet, they too had to meet a standard. If the bread fed to the palace's lesser ranks was ever found lacking, it would reflect poorly on the kitchen as a whole. No loaf, no matter how low in the hierarchy, escaped scrutiny. This internal order extended far beyond baking. Every role in the kitchen was layered with rules and unwritten expectations. The royal baker did not knead dough with the same hands that swept ashes from the oven floor. That task belonged to the kitchen scullions, young boys often hired from nearby villages, whose arms were thin but quick. They fetched water from the deep well, split logs for the ovens, and cleared away broken tiles or spilled flour. Their reward was not in coin, but in learning watching the master's work, mimicking gestures, absorbing the rhythm of the room. One day, if they survived the politics and the pressure, they might become apprentices. But most did not stay long. A mistake, an overheard insult, or even a misplaced sack could mean dismissal. Among these boys, stories traveled fast. They whispered about past bakers who had dared to experiment, adding dried herbs to crusts, brushing loaves with egg for shine, using a touch of honey in the kneading. Some of these ideas were praised. Others, when found by the steward or tasted by a particularly fastidious guest, led to immediate censure. The line between creativity and insubordination was thin. A baker might be told never to repeat an innovation again, without any explanation. Or worse, he might be reassigned to baking for the servants, his ambitions clipped like a loaf too close to the fire. Once, according to a story that circulated often among the younger staff, a visiting noble from Aquitaine asked for a specific bread, a dense round loaf baked with olive oil and cracked salt. The royal baker, at the time, eager to impress, agreed to prepare it. He had the ingredients smuggled in, used a secret recipe he'd learned from a southern merchant, and served the loaf warm during the noble's luncheon. The guest was delighted, but the steward, offended by the deviation from court protocol, reported the act to the chancellor. The baker was not punished publicly, but from that day forward, he was never again trusted with royal orders. His name, once spoken with respect in the kitchen halls, vanished from the lips of the staff. He remained in the palace another year, baking bread for the lower court, before retiring quietly to the countryside. For the baker, there were few allies. His work, though essential, was often solitary. The head cook might visit occasionally, mostly to coordinate menus. The steward delivered instructions but rarely lingered. Other bakers, if they existed within the same kitchen, worked in shifts alternating dawns and nights to keep the ovens burning without pause. And so the royal baker's companionship came from the tools of his trade, the mixing trough, worn smooth with use, the wooden peels, their handles dark with age, the linen-proofing cloths, carefully washed and dried by hand, folded and stored in the warmth above the oven. Even the flour sacks, stitched shut with thread pulled tight, became familiar. He learned their weight by feel, their scent by memory. Despite the silence of his position, he held power in one rare way. On feast days and high holidays, when nobles gathered in the great hall and the kitchens prepared elaborate banquets, the bread was the first thing served. Before the roasted quails, before the glazed pears and almond custards, before the wines flowed from cask to cup, the guests were given bread. And in that moment, even if unspoken, the baker's labor became the foundation of the event. If the bread was good, the meal began with grace. If it was not, nothing else could fix it. Nobles might speak of sauces and game meats, but the first bite came from his oven. Still, this prestige was fragile. A single complaint could unravel years of trust. If the queen's physician found the bread too dry, citing concerns about her digestion, the baker might be asked to alter the recipe, even if it meant compromising tradition. If a visiting bishop disliked the saltiness, adjustments would follow. The baker had no authority to resist. His skill was unquestioned, but his voice was quiet. In the court's hierarchy, he was not a creator. He was a servant of expectation. Yet beneath that weight, he found moments of meaning. In the early hours, when the palace still slept, he would step into the courtyard between shifts and breathe the cool air tinged with the scent of ivy and wood smoke. He would stretch his back, listen to the river beyond the gates, and let his hands rest, just briefly, on the stone ledge warmed by oven heat. He watched as candles flickered in the high windows of the chapel, as guards paced slowly in the towers. It was then that he remembered the world beyond the kitchen, a world of quiet stars and slow-moving clouds, a world where bread didn't carry pressure, only nourishment. Some nights, when the palace was still and the ovens had cooled, he kept a small round loaf for himself, unmarked, unclaimed, warm from the fire. He ate it in silence, sitting cross-legged on the stone floor. No gold plates or silver knives, just his calloused hands. He savored the softness of the crumb, the gentle crackle of crust, the faint sweetness that came only from flour, salt, and thyme. In those moments, the court vanished. The inspections, the risk, the rules, none of it mattered. There was only the bread. Honest, humble, and though no statue would ever bear his name, no chronicle record his deeds, the royal baker knew he had left his mark. In the quiet approval of a nodding steward, in the untouched plate of a satisfied noble, in the memory of a child who once stole a crust from a cooling tray and smiled. His work did not seek glory. It sought balance between tradition and taste, between invisibility and necessity, between the heat of the oven and the cold stone floor where he sat alone, one last loaf in his hands before rising to bake again. Chapter 5. The Baker's Guild and the Secret Oath of the Oven. In the crowded, cobblestone heart of medieval Paris, the Baker's Guild stood as both protector and gatekeeper. It was not housed in a grand cathedral or towering hall, but in an unassuming stone building tucked between a tannery and a fishmonger near Rue de la Verrerie. The exterior bore no lavish decorations, just a carved wooden sign of a wheat sheaf swinging gently in the wind, and the faint, ever-present scent of flour clinging to the doorway. There were rituals, subtle, secretive, passed down through whispered instruction and carefully guarded documents. It took place in the guild hall's rear chamber, behind a door carved with the image of Saint Honor, the patron of bakers, whose legend reminded all that miracles were often baked, not born. He swore to uphold the guild's standards, to protect its secrets, to never undercut a fellow baker, and to maintain the integrity of the city's bread. He also swore not to teach outsiders the guild's ratios, especially those involving the king's flour, and not to sell spoiled bread to the poor. If broken, these oaths carried penalties that ranged from fines to banishment. Favors were traded quietly assignments for festival baking. Deliveries to noble houses, appointments to steward positions within the guild. Their names were inked in the back of the ledger, marked with a diagonal slash. Some of these men had fled the city, their ovens seized by the guild and sold to others. It was to be part of a legacy one built not on fame or fortune, but on resilience. And feel the weight of it all, not as a burden, but as belonging. Because while the bread rose in the oven, he rose within a lineage, one loaf at a time, one oath upheld. The ovens of Paris burned day after day because the guild endured. Through famine and riot, through taxes and theft, through kings and queens who came and went, the bread remained, shaped by the same hands, measured by the same standards, protected by the same oath. A few tried to continue baking in secret, operating illegal ovens behind butcher shops or under taverns. But if caught, they were brought before the council, fined heavily, and if repeat offenders forced to wear a wooden sign around their neck proclaiming their crimes. There are records of such punishments where disgraced bakers stood in public squares, stale loaves nailed to their tunics, while passers-by spat or jeered. The humiliation was meant not to destroy, but to warn. Power moved slowly and subtly, like sourdough left to rise in a cool cellar. A baker might spend decades within the guild without ever being invited to the council chamber. But if he kept his head down, paid his dues, and never drew attention, he might be granted a small position of influence, permission to train an apprentice, or a contract with the city for charitable bread. In the most severe cases, such as selling adulterated bread during famine, the guilty baker could be publicly shamed, stripped of guild protection, and barred from baking within the city walls. The room was dark, lit by 3 candles placed in a triangle. When a member died, the guild arranged for a small ceremony, with loaves baked in his honor and distributed to the poor. If a baker's family faced hardship, a collection was raised. Apprentices who fell ill were tended to by elder bakers' wives, women who had seen the same fevers pass through many young hands. And once a year, on the feast day of St. Honore, the guild held a procession through the city. Members wore clean aprons, carried gilded loaves on silver trays, and marched from the guild hall to the nearest cathedral, offering bread at the altar. It was the only day the guild opened its doors to outsiders, inviting the city to witness not just their bread, but their pride, and pooled funds for emergencies, such as when an oven collapsed or a shipment was stolen en route. Inspections were routine and sometimes harsh, with senior members examining everything from dough consistency to firewood quality. Innovations were discouraged unless approved. Any change in recipe or shape had to be submitted in writing and demonstrated before the council. This stifled creativity but preserved consistency. In a city where bread riots flared at the smallest provocation, predictability was considered sacred. If an inspector came knocking with unreasonable demands, the guild could dispatch a steward to mediate. If a baker was accused of underweight loaves, the guild provided a master to test and verify. Without this safety net, a baker stood alone against the city's shifting laws, hungry mobs, and the ruthless economics of grain. At its center stood an iron-bound book, its pages thick with flour dust, its ink faded from generations of handling. This was the guild ledger, where names were entered only after the oath. A baker could not simply declare themselves part of the guild. They had to be invited. First came apprenticeship, often lasting 5 to 7 years. During this time, a young baker learned not just the technique of dough and flame, but the discipline of routine, the quiet politics of the trade, and the invisible hierarchy of seniority. He rose before dawn. He burned his palms learning the oven's moods. He scrubbed stones with vinegar until his knuckles split. And when he'd proven his commitment, his sponsor might finally deem him ready. But inside, behind creaking doors and tightly shuttered windows, decisions were made that shaped the city's bread, its weight, its price, its distribution, and perhaps most powerfully, its secrecy. To become a baker in Paris was not as simple as owning an oven. It required approval, apprenticeship, dues, and eventually admission to the guild. The guild was a powerful body, woven into the city's structure with quiet authority. It regulated who could bake, what ingredients were acceptable, how loaves should be shaped, and what prices could be charged. It operated under royal license, but answered to no single person. Instead, it functioned through a council, usually older bakers who had proven themselves over decades. Men whose hands bore burned scars and whose voices carried the weight of long experience. To an outsider, the guild may have seemed like a trade association, but to those within, it resembled something closer to a brotherhood. The initiation was not grand, nor was it public. The oath itself was simple but binding. The initiate placed one hand on the ledger and the other on a round loaf, baked that morning by his own hands. Guild protection was not just symbolic, it was tangible. Bakers under the guild's wing had access to preferred millers, shared storage facilities for flour during bad weather, but guild membership came at a cost. Dues were collected monthly, regardless of a baker's profits. There were also layers of internal politics. Younger members were expected to defer to older ones, even if their bread was better. The guild also maintained a record of blacklisted individuals bakers who had cheated, lied, or broken the oath. Despite its rigidness, the guild had its softer moments. To belong to the guild was to belong to something greater than flour and fire. And in the quiet hours before dawn, when the city still slept, a guild baker might pause, hand on his peel. Though the Bakers' Guild of Paris operated with structure and strength, it was not immune to tension within its own ranks. Behind the shared oaths and ceremonial processions lay a simmering layer of rivalry, ambition, and quiet resentment. Bakers were, after all, human subject to jealousy when a peer secured a prestigious contract with a noble household, or when an apprentice rose quickly through the ranks. These moments, while rarely spoken aloud, shifted the air inside the guild hall like smoke in a cooling oven. When a new tax was proposed on imported grain, the guild negotiated exemptions for certain members. A member found guilty of cutting flour with crushed beans, for instance, might be assigned to bake only low-tier bread for a full season, a professional demotion that stripped him of prestige and income. When a fire swept through the left bank and destroyed 3 bakehouses, the guild dispatched flour, timber, and labor to assist in rebuilding. It was not open to the public and never held in the same place twice. Every member, whether a new apprentice or a council elder, stood before the open ledger and placed a hand on a loaf baked that morning. In that moment, all were equal. All were bound by the same promise to bake with integrity, to protect the city's bread. It was a living tradition, a structure of soot and fire, kneaded through with memory. It held the city's hunger in its calloused hands, balanced pride with punishment, and shaped the rhythm of daily life without ever demanding thanks. Its members did not wear crowns or command armies, but they held a power all their own, the power to feed, to nourish, and, when needed, to refuse, and to honor the traditions that had shaped their craft for generations. Afterward, the loaves were broken and shared, passed between scarred hands and soot-darkened fingers. There was no wine, just bread. And in its quiet simplicity, the guild remembered its purpose. Sometimes it took place in a cathedral's crypt, with candles flickering against stone arches. They feared its rules but longed for its approval. They practiced shaping loaves with trembling hands, hoping their rounds would one day earn a nod from a master. They listened at doors, repeated stories of past controversies, and dared to dream of sitting at the long oak table in the hall's upper chamber. Some succeeded. Others, worn down by early hours and low pay, drifted away. They became innkeepers, porters, scribes. But even years later, if they passed a bakery and smelled the crust of a fresh loaf, they paused, remembering the guild's discipline, its dignity, its quiet weight. Other times, it was arranged in the back room of a tavern or in the garden of a retired master baker whose oven had long gone cold. At this gathering, masked by feast and formality, the council shared updates on trade routes, discussed grain shortages, and debated changes to the guild's internal codes. Disagreements were common, voices rose, but the tone remained measured. The guild believed in slow decisions, like dough left to rest overnight. Hasty choices were frowned upon, their consequences unpredictable. When a baker's child fell ill, the wives of senior members gathered to bring food and herbs. And during the hardest winters, when grain imports stalled and loaves shrank in size, the guild quietly redirected surplus stock from its wealthier members to struggling shops, ensuring that no neighborhood went entirely without bread. These acts weren't advertised. There were no announcements or plaques, but they stitched the guild together in ways more powerful than any oath. Others were denied the right to carry the guild's emblem on their storefronts, a symbolic exile even if they remained within the fold. Worst of all was the black mark, a tiny symbol etched next to a name in the ledger, visible only to council members. It meant that while the baker was still allowed to work, he would never again be trusted with sensitive tasks. No royal orders, no festival breads, no apprentices. The ovens would stay warm, but the path upward was closed. When the city threatened to increase inspections after a riot, it was the guild that intervened, assuring the magistrates that order would be maintained internally. These protections were rarely visible to the public, but inside the guild, they were proof of its value, proof that loyalty had rewards. A baker who fell into trouble could expect a council hearing, often held at night, behind closed doors. There, his case would be considered by candlelight, weighed by men who understood the toll of early mornings and fickle fire. A subtle narrowing of the eyes when a name was read aloud. A brief silence before polite applause. The guild prided itself on harmony, but beneath the flower-dusted camaraderie was a world of competition and a long memory for slights. Newer members, particularly those without family connections, often found advancement slow and uncertain. If your father had not been a baker, if you lacked a patron among the elders, you would wait longer for your moment. The tale of Laurent the mill hand, who worked his way from grain porter to master baker through sheer tenacity and flawless crusts. Or at least of the southern slopes who disguised herself as her deceased brother and maintained his oven for nearly 2 years before revealing her identity. At which point the guild, impressed by her skill and courage, quietly made space for her. These tales, while whispered with awe, were also reminders of how rigid the system could be. For every success, 100 others vanished in obscurity, their ambition extinguished beneath unpaid dues and unfulfilled promises. You might be assigned the least desirable delivery routes, tasked with baking low-grade loaves for taverns instead of refined rounds for merchant families. You might even be denied permission to take on apprentices of your own. These restrictions weren't formal, they were never written down, but they were understood. Influence flowed through relationships, and relationships were shaped by loyalty, or at least by silence. And yet, in rare instances, a baker from outside the traditional bloodlines would rise. These stories became legend among the apprentices. The guild also served as a silent buffer between the bakers and the city's authorities. Punishment within the guild was as much about shame as it was about justice. Yet even in strictest moments, the guild offered solidarity. Every year, the guild also hosted its secret convocation, known only to its members. During the convocation, there was also a ritual reaffirmation of the oath. Among the apprentices, the guild was a mystery, at once rigid and romantic. In the end, the Bakers' Guild was not simply an organization. Chapter 6: Heat, Ash, and Backbreaking Labor. The sun had not yet risen, but the fire already roared. Inside the stone-walled bakeries of medieval Paris, heat was the first and most enduring sensation. It was a living thing, pulsing from the heart of every oven, pressing against the skin like a heavy breath. The walls absorbed it. The floor radiated it. And the bakers stooped, sweating, sleeves rolled to the elbow, endured it. Not for an hour, not for two, but for 14 long, unbroken hours, 6 days a week, sometimes 7 if demand swelled or feast days loomed. This was not work in the modern sense. It was survival wrapped in rhythm, measured not by clocks but by crusts. The ovens themselves were built like vault-rounded domes, made of thick masonry, designed to trap and circulate heat without any form of regulation. There were no dials, no thermometers. A baker judged temperature by the crackle of wood, the color of ash, the way the hairs on his arms curled when he leaned in to check the flames. If he judged wrong, the bread would burn or collapse. And when dozens of loaves needed to be perfect each for a different customer, each with its own weight and standard, there was no room for hesitation. The fire demanded attention. It did not pause. It did not forgive. The morning began with wood and lots of it. The logs, usually delivered in bulk and stacked in damp alleys, needed to be chopped and carried inside. Apprentices took on this task, hauling bundles across slippery stones, their shoulders raw by midday. The bark stuck to their skin, splinters burrowed into fingers already stiff with cold. Then came the lighting, not with matches or fuel, but with steel and flint, coaxed patiently from spark to flame. A baker might spend 30 minutes kneeling before the oven's open mouth, feeding it dry kindling, whispering to it through gritted teeth. Once lit, the flames had to be managed hot enough to heat the stone, but not so wild that they cracked it. The balance was delicate and always at risk of tipping. As the oven reached its peak, the real work began. Dough, prepared in the still hours before dawn, had to be shaped quickly and uniformly. Each round was weighed, stretched, folded, and set aside on flour-dusted boards. But shaping bread was not a passive task. It required firm pressure, strong wrists, and an instinct for timing. Too much kneading and the dough would toughen. Too little and it wouldn't rise. The baker stood hunched over the bench, hour after hour, pushing and turning and pushing, sweat dripping from brow to counter, wiped away without a thought. Muscles burned. Shoulders ached. There was no time to stop, no reason to complain. This was simply how bread was made. And then came the baking. Loaves were slid into the oven with long wooden peels, tools heavy enough to strain the arms and awkward enough to bruise the shins if swung carelessly. The baker had to crouch, pivot, balance, and slide, all in one motion, without knocking the rising loaves or letting in too much cold air. Inside the oven, the bread transformed rapidly. Its outer shell hardened into crust. The interior expanded, steam hissing quietly from within. But this miracle of transformation depended entirely on vigilance. Loaves had to be rotated, shifted, and pulled at precisely the right moment. And with dozens baking at once, each at a different stage, the baker's mind had to remain sharp, his movements practiced nearly mechanical. All the while, the heat never relented. It soaked through every layer of clothing, pressed into the flesh beneath. The stone floor, warmed by the oven's foundation, radiated upward. The air grew thick and unmoving. Even when the bakery door stood open, it offered little relief, just a draft of soot and distant noise. Bakers drank water by the ladle, their mouths often too dry to swallow comfortably. Some wrapped wet cloths around their necks. Others simply endured, saying little, focusing on the task. The workroom echoed with the dull thud of loaves hitting boards. The scrape of peels against stone, the hiss of flour meeting flame, the ash was ever present. It clung to every surface, benches, baskets, hair, teeth. It settled in folds of cloth and the corners of eyes. At the end of a long shift, the baker's skin bore its mark, a fine gray sheen, only partly removed with a wash. Ash had to be cleared between batches, shoveled out with wide iron scrapers, dumped into soot-stained barrels that lined the alley walls. Sometimes sparks still glowed within the mounds, and a careless apprentice could set the refuse pile smoldering. More than one bakery fire began not in the oven, but just outside it, in a moment of fatigue when no one was watching. The body paid a price for this labor. Knees swelled, backs hunched. Hands split open in winter and blistered in summer. Older bakers walked with a limp, their shoulders crooked from years of lifting flour sacks and bending over hot stone. Some lost the use of fingers. Others developed chronic cough from inhaling soot and flour dust. And yet they continued. Because there were mouths to feed, debts to pay, guild dues to meet, because the bread was needed. And because, even in the harshest moments, there was pride. Pride not in grandeur, but in craft. In knowing that the loaves stacked in the cooling racks would nourish a family, comfort a child, form the center of a meager meal. In knowing that despite the heat, the pain, the endless repetition, the baker's hands had created something essential. Something honest, something good. There were no breaks, no scheduled pauses or relief shifts. A baker ate when he could, a crust in one hand while the other turned a peel, a few sips of watered wine between batches. The midday bell often rang unnoticed. Time passed in loaves, not hours. By late afternoon, as the final rounds were pulled from the fading oven and set to cool, exhaustion arrived quietly. Not as collapse, but as stillness. The work was done. The tools were wiped clean, the benches scrubbed, the embers allowed to die. And as dusk settled over the rooftops, the baker stood in the doorway, the sweat on his back cooling too quickly in the breeze. His hands, raw and flour-crusted, hung loosely at his sides. His body ached, but his shelves were full. Bread for the night, for the poor, for the market. He had endured another day in the heat through ash and flame, and left behind rows of golden loaves, each one a silent testament to his labor. As the evening descended, and the soot-covered tools were set aside, the baker did not rest immediately. The day might have ended for the city outside, but for those within the bakery walls, there were still tasks that reached into the night. The faint creak of wood, the low scrape of iron, the hush of smoldering ash, it was a language spoken only by those who baked for a living. A rhythm as old as the city itself, older perhaps, stretching back through generations of sweat-stained tunics and burn-scarred wrists, not as drifting, but as descent. Muscles gave way, breath slowed, and the body surrendered completely. For a few hours, the fire of the day ebbed. Dreams, if they came, were often simple, a loaf rising perfectly. They began their chores silently fetching water from the well, hauling sacks of flour, splitting logs. These tasks were not designed to teach so much as to harden. The rhythmic slap of dough hitting the bench, the hollow thud of a baked loaf landing in a basket, the low groan of the oven door as it opened, the quick exhale of steam. These sounds formed a kind of orchestra, one that repeated endlessly but changed with each performance. A baker listened not with his ears alone, but with his whole body. He could feel when something was wrong, a shift in air pressure, a delay in the rise, a slight tightening in the dough's texture. He didn't explain it, he adjusted. That was the second rule of baking. You could not force the bread. You had to respond to it. Only those who endured could hope to become bakers themselves. And while some apprentices rebelled, some ran away, others accepted the silence. In summer, it became unbearable. The air grew thick, heavy, unmoving. Some helped with kneading. Others ran small side ovens out of back rooms, especially in poorer districts. Their work was just as hard, sometimes harder, and their efforts often went unrecognized. But the dough didn't care about status. It rose or fell the same under any hands. The oven demanded the same fuel. And so, without fanfare, women baked alongside men, unseen by the guild, but known to their neighbors. Their bread fed whole alleys, orphanages, and tenement rows. Their crusts were thicker, their loaves more forgiving. But they carried the same weight. Ovens reached temperatures so intense that cloths hung nearby began to smoke. A baker stood once more in his doorway, staring into the street beyond. People passed, some with satchels, some with tired steps. Children ran. Merchants shouted. But within the bakery there was quiet, a stillness earned through motion. The fire would be lit again soon. The flour would be sifted. The cycle would begin again. And the baker, aching and weary, would begin again too, not because he wished to, but because it was what he did. Bread was not a choice. It was a rhythm, one shaped by hands, heat, ash, and labor. Always labor. Bakers wrapped damp rags around their heads, drank whatever sour wine was available, and pushed through. Fainting was not uncommon. Neither was vomiting from exhaustion. And still they baked, because the city did not stop eating. Because failure meant shame. Because a day without bread was a day without dignity. Not just for the baker, but for every hand that reached across a wooden counter with a coin in its palm. They carried the burden without complaint, because the first rule of baking was endurance. No one who quit ever returned. And no one who stayed ever forgot. A child smiling at a bite of warm bread. A market day with no shouting, no broken scales, no missed orders. The kind of dreams that required no explanation, just silence, and the faint smell of yeast, still clinging to hair and skin. And as the last light dimmed, the baker stepped back to survey the room. Before long, the faintest sound of foot traffic or a bell in the distance signaled the beginning of the next day. A baker's life was not segmented to clean days and nights. It was continuous, like dough fermenting in a quiet bowl, growing slowly whether watched or not. Fatigue layered itself like sediment, soft and constant. Yet even as eyelids twitched open and the knees protested another day of lifting, the body moved. Habit propelled it forward. Duty, too. It was not spotless, but it was clean. It bore the mark of effort, not disorder. The benches were clear. The loaves were cooling. Tomorrow would come soon. But for now, there was a moment brief, precious in which everything was still. The same go. The same shaping. The same careful slide into the same glowing oven, over and over, day after day. There were no real surprises, no holidays in the modern sense. Even feast days brought more work, not less. More loaves, more demands, longer shifts. But in the middle of this monotony, bakers developed a kind of deep intimacy with their craft. They noticed the smallest shifts, the change in flour texture with humidity, the slight variation in yeast smell between summer and winter, the way a particular firewood gave a different hue to the crust. These details were never written down. They were learned by living them, The ovens, though cooling, had to be swept again, carefully, thoroughly, so no embers remained to spark an accidental fire. The boards used for shaping needed scrubbing, not just for hygiene, but to prevent hardened dough from setting into grooves and attracting rodents. The baskets were turned upside down, dusted, and set in their places. And the floor, sticky from flour and moisture, had to be swept and rinsed. The labor was constant, repetitive, but oddly meditative. These rituals ended the day as surely as the rising sun had begun it. Even as the body ached and the joints stiffened, there was something soothing in the finality of closing the oven door for the night. Most bakers slept above their shops, in cramped lofts, just big enough for a straw mattress, a few blankets, and a shelf or two for bread left to cool away from the mice. The heat from the ovens below crept upward, warming the small spaces even on the coldest nights. Some found comfort in this. Others cursed the constant warmth, the way it made sleep shallow and sweat cling to the skin. But they adapted. They had no choice. The stairs to these lofts were steep, the beams low. A baker learned quickly how to duck, how to step softly so as not to disturb the dough proofing below. These quarters were not meant for comfort. They were meant for proximity to the tools, the oven, the trade. And when sleep came, it came hard. But rest was brief. The city's rhythm would not pause. Apprentices rose first, sometimes shaking from cold or aching from the day before, their eyes heavy, their movements clumsy in the dark. For those already initiated, the hardest part was often not the physical toll, but the repetition. There was also the sound, the unique music of the bakery. Heat remained the greatest challenge. Women occasionally worked in the bakeries too, though less publicly. As night fell again, the fire began to fade, and the ashes cooled to soft gray powder. Chapter 7. The Great Yeast Wars. Long before packets of dry yeast sat neatly on pantry shelves. Long before the process of fermentation was broken down into molecules and microscopes, bakers worked with something that felt much more like mystery than science. In medieval Paris, yeast was not fully understood. It was observed. It was coaxed. It was feared, even worshipped in quiet ways, depending on whether your dough rose with strength or collapsed into ruin. What we now know to be a colony of microscopic fungi was, to the bakers of the 13th century, something almost spiritual alive, temperamental, invisible, and capable of deciding the success or failure of an entire day's work. They called it by many names. Leaven, levain, the mother, the starter. Some referred to it as the breath of bread, others simply as the beast. It was a mixture of flour and water left exposed to the open air, bubbling over time with wild yeast captured from the environment. Each bakery had its own starter, usually kept in a ceramic pot near the oven's warmth, sometimes wrapped in cloth, sometimes stirred with the same wooden spoon passed down for generations. This starter was both tool and treasure. If it died, if the bubbles stopped, if the smell turned sharply sour, if the mixture collapsed into gray sludge, it could mean a week's worth of ruined bread and no income to show for it. And so, bakers became caretakers of this strange substance. They fed it, they watched it, they spoke to it. Some swore by exact feeding schedules, adding flour at dawn and dusk, using only water drawn from specific wells. Others insisted that starters preferred the hands of certain bakers, reacting better to the touch of those who had the gift. Whether these beliefs were superstition or early intuition, they shaped the rhythm of baking in profound ways. A baker could knead for hours, haul flour across slippery stones, and fire an oven until his back ached. But if the leaven failed, it was all for nothing. Disputes over yeast were not rare. Among the bakers of Paris, Tales of stolen starters were whispered with a tone usually reserved for betrayal. One such story involved a journeyman who, after years of apprenticeship, secretly took a portion of his master's leaven before leaving to open a bakery across the river. Within months, his bread outsold that of his former teacher. Furious, the elder baker accused him of theft before the guild. No law covered such a crime, but the insult was clear. The journeyman's reputation suffered, and though his business survived, his name was rarely spoken with respect afterward. Among bakers, to steal a man's starter was not just to rob him of bread, it was to rob him of his soul. There were other tales too. Loaves that failed for weeks until a new leaven was introduced, seemingly blessed by St. Honor himself. Starters that reacted violently to being moved, refusing to bubble when relocated to a different oven or stone bench. In some bakeries, a piece of the mother starter was buried in the ground outside the door to keep it grounded, as one old baker phrased it. In others, the starter was covered with a thin sheet of beeswax, meant to protect it from bad air. When the leaven grew too strong or fermented too quickly, some would say it had been cursed, possibly by jealous rivals or by apprentices careless with their speech. This deep attachment to yeast led to rivalry that at times bordered on war. Bakers argued over fermentation times, temperature, even the type of wood burned near the starter's resting place. Some claimed rye flour created a more resilient starter. Others swore by pure wheat. The debate spilled into guild meetings, into back alley conversations, into hushed remarks exchanged over sacks of flour. Once, in the early 1300s, a guild elder had to settle a bitter dispute between two master bakers who accused each other of sabotaging their starters with spoiled flour. No proof was found, but both men were fined and warned never to enter each other's districts again. Still, in spite of the conflict, or perhaps because of it, the culture around yeast gave rise to innovation. Some bakers began to share techniques in secret, whispering their feeding routines to trusted friends or family. Recipes were passed in code, described with metaphors rather than measurements. A scoop of moonlight meant water drawn at night. A fold of wind meant allowing the dough to rest uncovered by the window. These phrases, strange as they sound, carried a kind of poetry, a language shared among those who worked with living dough day after day. At times, the church intervened. Curious monks recorded their own experiments in monastery kitchens, using beer dregs or leftover wine to start fermentation. Some of the most resilient leavens came from these experiment starters that fed generations of monastic bread, thick and dark, perfect for fasting seasons. These sacred starters were guarded with the same reverence as holy relics. One Benedictine bakery near Paris was said to possess a leaven that had survived 7 abbots, 3 fires, and 1 siege. Its caretaker, a monk named Brother Thomas, wrote of it as one might describe a fellow brother. She lives quietly in her jar, rising with purpose, resting with peace. And yet, for all this reverence, yeast remained unpredictable. Even seasoned bakers had days when their starter refused to rise. On humid days, it grew sluggish. In the cold, it went dormant. It bloomed at odd hours, sometimes too early, sometimes too late, and no amount of shouting or coaxing could fix it. A baker could do everything, right, and still find himself holding a bowl of heavy, lifeless dough as the sun rose outside and customers began knocking at the door. In those moments, there was no recourse. The loaves would be fewer, the income smaller, and the risk of complaints much higher. A baker might attempt to mask the failure adding ale to the mix to boost fermentation, baking flatter loaves or cutting them into pieces and labeling them as biscuits. But if the flavor betrayed him, if the texture failed, the inspector would know, and the punishment could follow swiftly. So most bakers, when met with a failed leaven, simply lowered their heads and began again. They cleaned the jar, fed it fresh flour, waited. That was the rhythm. Feed, wait, trust. There's no control, only stewardship. And in this strange reliance on something unseen, something that could not be commanded, the baker learned humility. He learned patience. And he learned that sometimes the bread did not rise, and that too was part of the craft. The most devoted bakers came to treat their starters almost like family. They gave them names, sometimes whimsical, sometimes biblical. In a small shop near Saint Germain, one baker referred to his as Magdalene, claiming she had moods, could sense his health, and behaved better when he sang to her while kneading. Another, in the Marais district, kept his starter in a clay pot lined with lavender, convinced it absorbed the scent and gave his loaves a gentler aroma. These attachments weren't just sentimental. They were a form of coping with the unpredictability that hovered over every batch. To anthropomorphize the yeast, to treat it as a companion rather than a force of nature, made the labor a little less lonely. But with sentiment came superstition. As fermentation science lagged far behind observation, myth filled the void. Some bakers believed that a starter could inherit the personality of the baker who created it. A gentle hand would raise a sweet leaven. A temperamental baker would find his starter volatile. Certain bakers refused to let their apprentices touch the starter jar at all, fearing contamination of temperament, not bacteria. These beliefs weren't questioned. There was no proof against them, and sometimes the evidence seemed to support them. After all, when a starter went bad, it felt deeply personal, like betrayal, like heartbreak in a bowl. The idea of good yeast and bad yeast fed quiet rivalries between bakeries. One baker's reliable rise was another's envy. During times of shortage, when flour was precious and customers' scarce, rumors swirled through the alleys, claims that a rival bakery S. Leaven had been blessed by a pilgrim, or that a sourdough had survived from the time of Charlemagne. Some of these starters were indeed old handed down through generations, moved from oven to oven like an heirloom. When a bakery closed, the starter was rarely discarded. It was transferred, given to a nephew, a friend, a neighboring baker who had proved trustworthy. A leaven, once mature, was seen as too valuable to die. During certain seasons, particularly in late spring when temperature shifts made fermentation tricky, bakers gathered in secret to compare notes. These weren't formal guild meetings. They were informal huddles, quiet conversations held after dark. In the corners of flour houses, over mugs of thin beer and baskets of crusts. Each baker would describe his starter's behavior, how quickly it bubbled, how strongly it rose, whether it had turned overly sour or stopped rising altogether. They would speak in hushed tones, carefully, as if afraid the dough itself might hear. These discussions weren't just technical, they were therapeutic. For in the life of a baker, where most labor went unrecognized, where perfection was expected and failure could mean financial ruin, it helped to know that others also struggled, that even the best leavens faltered. There was a kind of camaraderie forged through this quiet vulnerability. Bakers who had once eyed each other with suspicion shared scraps of mother starters when others had died. They offered advice in metaphor. Try feeding her when the wind is still, or she may need more time to breathe. They exchanged scraps of sourdough folded into cloth, trading not just yeast, but trust. These gestures, though small, held immense weight. For a baker to give part of his leaven to another was to expose himself, an act of humility, generosity, and shared burden. Of course, there were exceptions. Not all bakers were generous. Some guarded their starters with paranoia, locking them away at night, refusing to let even trusted apprentices near. A few developed elaborate rituals around their maintenance, feeding them only at certain times of day, speaking aloud prayers while mixing, refusing to store them in metal for fear it would taint the yeast. One baker, nicknamed the Whisperer, refused to let anyone see him mix his dough. He worked behind closed doors, insisted on silence in the bakery while the starter fermented, and claimed that even loud voices could disturb the rice. Whether his bread was better is hard to say. But he sold out most days, and the legend of his silence grew larger than the loaves he baked. Then there were the starter wars. These weren't violent, but they were fiercely competitive. During festivals and holy days, when markets swelled with customers and the city pulsed with celebration, each baker strove to present his finest bread. And because ingredients were often the same, the starter became the differentiating factor. Some bakers began to showcase their leavened lineage made with 50-year mother, one would boast, while another would claim. Starter traced to the Abbey of St. Denis. These boasts weren't verifiable, but they didn't have to be. Customers were drawn to the mystique, to the idea that in this one round loaf was a piece of something ancient, something magical, something quietly powerful. Over time, certain starters gained reputations. In the same way a painter's brush or a blacksmith's hammer might become famous for what it created, some leavens became known by name. The Saint Michel sponge, for instance, was rumored to produce a tang so precise it was recognizable blindfolded. The widow's breath, a starter used in a shop run by a widowed baker in the Latin Quarter, was said to produce loaves with an uncanny softness. Customers swore they could feel it through their teeth, like biting into memory. Whether the bread truly differed or not, the belief gave it weight. And belief in the absence of science was enough. But not every yeast story ended in pride. Starters went bad. Loaves collapsed. Entire batches were tossed, and with them half a week's income. The loss was quiet, but crushing. Some bakers, in a final act of grief, buried their failed starters in courtyards or beneath the hearth, believing they had served a purpose and deserved rest. Others poured them into the river, watching the milky trail vanish in the current, a silent farewell to something that had once lived in their care. These moments weren't marked with ceremony, but they stayed with the bakers. Long after the pots were cleaned and the flour restocked, they remembered. In a world where fire, flour, and labor were constants, yeast remained the one element that refused to be fully tamed. And in that uncertainty, in that unpredictability, the baker found both frustration and awe. It reminded him that no matter how skilled, no matter how precise, he was not fully in control. He was part of a dance, 1 foot in craft, 1 foot in chance. And so each night, as the loaves cooled and the streets outside quieted, a small pot sat near the oven, gently bubbling, rising with life unseen. It was quiet. It was humble. But it held within it centuries of knowledge, rivalry, failure, and faith. It was not just yeast. It was memory. And it breathed still. Chapter 8. Women Behind the Bread. In the official records of the Bakers' Guild, you'll find few women's names. The ledgers, scrolls, and charters refer almost exclusively to men Zhang Diong, Robert names inked with confidence and stamped with approval. But history's paperwork does not always reflect its reality. In the alleys of Paris, behind shuttered kitchens and low-slung ceilings, women baked. Their children still slept in straw beds as they mixed dough in wooden bowls worn smooth with use. There was no room for error. A loaf too small would anger a neighbor. A crust too hard might be refused. Flour had to be stretched with boiled roots or mashed peas, disguised with clever shaping or extra scoring on the crust. When inspectors passed through, these women hid their tools, claiming to be preparing gruel or roasting roots. Some bribed officials with free loaves. One legend tells of a baker's wife, known only as Margot of the Steam, who ran her husband's bakery in secret after he died during a grain riot. Lady cooks kept detailed notes on which flour yielded the best texture, which fires burned most evenly, and which servants could be trusted not to burn the crust. Recipes were passed through letters, scribbled in the margins of herbals and cookbooks. The most prized loaves were those with a story bread baked to celebrate a birth, shaped in the form of flowers or flavored with lavender and honey. Though men wrote the recipes in official guild texts, women preserved them in practice. For 2 years, she delivered bread through back doors, wearing a man's cloak, baking at night. They introduced variations, preserved family techniques, and trained the next generation before boys ever entered formal apprenticeships. The knowledge lived in hands, not books and the way a thumb pressed dough, in how long to let it rest by the fire and how to coax a rise from weak flour. It was a knowledge passed not in ceremony, but in daily action, quiet, repetitive, vital. When the guild finally discovered her identity, she was brought before a tribunal, but her loaves had been too good, her reputation too solid. Their hands, rough from kneading, steady from repetition, offered more than just sustenance. They offered warmth, continuity, dignity, and in a city where hunger was always close and comfort rare, that mattered. That endured. The punishment was never enforced. Instead, she was quietly given permission to continue under a cousin's name. Her story, though barely recorded, lived on in whispered praise among market women and fellow widows. Others learned which days to stay silent and which streets to avoid. Their entire profession operated like a whispered secret passed from mother to daughter. They kneaded dough beside children, stoked fires while watching boiling pots. If caught baking without a license, a woman could be fined or worse, have her tools seized, her fire doused, her name reported to the magistrates. Religious sisters, though bound by strict codes of labor and worship, were often skilled in the kitchen. Though men often needed the public loaves, it was women who taught the first lessons in dough, how to judge water temperature by touch, how to shape rolls with one hand while holding a child with the other. They baked in hearths shared with stews, sharing heat, juggling time. The bread they made wasn't always round or perfectly browned, but it was remembered. Children grew up associating comfort with the scent of their mother's bread. A crust torn in the kitchen carried more meaning than one purchased from a storefront. This was bread not for sale, but for family. They maintained gardens, boiled preserves, and yes, baked bread not just for themselves, but for the sick, the poor, and the orphaned. Their bread was simpler, often symbolic, made with intention rather than flair. Still, these loaves mattered. They were handed out during feast days, tucked into baskets for widows, wrapped in cloth and left at the gates of the needy. While the guild debated flour weights and fermentation times, these women offered bread without price or paperwork. And in that there was quiet power. Guild bakers, protective of their trade, sometimes reported such women, especially when times were hard and competition fierce, but not always. Some guild members, especially older ones, turned a blind eye, recognizing the quiet necessity of their work. They understood, even if they couldn't admit it openly, that these women were not stealing customers. They were serving those who had been abandoned by the system, and carried baskets of warm loaves through morning fog with no guild seal, no shop front, no public recognition. Their names were not written, but their bread was eaten. Officially, women were restricted from baking professionally in medieval Paris. Guild statutes insisted that only men could hold licenses, manage shops, or sign grain contracts. These were small, makeshift bakehouses, sometimes just a fireplace and a flat stone, where bread was baked for neighbors who couldn't afford dual-priced loaves. The ingredients were basic: coarse rye, cracked barley, water, and sometimes stale dough from the day before to give the loaf weight. These loaves were heavy, sometimes scorched, but they were warm and they filled stomachs. The women who baked them charged little and earned even less. But in a time when hunger shadowed every doorstep, their work made the difference between subsistence and starvation. Yet economic necessity has always ignored official lines. Widows of bakers sometimes took over their husbands' ovens out of sheer need, especially when children were still young. Others partnered with relatives, brothers, sons, cousins, who held the license and name while the woman did the work. There were even cases where women ran the shop front while men handled the baking behind the scenes. Using their husband's credentials as legal cover, everyone knew, but no one said anything. The bread was good. The flour was paid for. The rules bent in silence. In poorer districts, especially along the outer walls of the city and near the markets, women often operated what were called alley ovens. They woke early often, before the official bakery stirred. There was risk. Within convents, women baked for survival and for charity. At home, bread was also a woman's responsibility, and there were stories too, of women who defied the rules entirely. Even in noble households, women supervised the baking, if not the kneading. Their contributions, while unofficial, shaped the city's bread in ways the guild could never fully acknowledge. Their labor went unseen by law, but not by those they fed. Though the women who baked in medieval Paris lived without formal acknowledgement, they built networks of quiet resilience across the neighborhoods of Saint Antoine and the marshy flats of the outer. Faubourgs, women shared flour when one ran short-loaned kindling when the woodcart was late, and traded crusts of stale bread for a scoop of salt or a bit of honey. These exchanges were rarely documented, but they formed a parallel economy once sustained not by contracts or guilds, but by trust, memory, and shared hardship. And support her husband's work if he were part of a formal bakery. Though too frail to knead dough, still advised younger ones on how to time a fire or judge a flour's coarseness. In families that owned multiple shops or held stakes in grain trade, wives often managed the financial ledgers, oversaw transactions, and advised on business decisions behind closed doors. It was not uncommon for a husband to defer to his wife's instincts about pricing or product variety. A spoiled starter could mean borrowing from a neighbor, enduring the embarrassment of needing help. And when things went badly, when fire destroyed a bakehouse, or illness swept through a family, it was often the woman who carried the burden forward. She gathered the ashes, salvaged what she could, and began again. No lament, just labor. Because the bread had to be made. In cases where the husband traveled, whether for grain procurement, trade fairs, or personal pilgrimage, the wife often ran the business in his absence. It was said that some could cure a sluggish dough just by whispering to it. A child asked why the bread tasted different. The scent that used to drift down the alley each morning was gone. Perhaps someone lit a candle. Perhaps someone baked her recipe the next day in her honor. But more often, the world moved on. Her work by others, her memory folded into dough by daughters or granddaughters who had watched her for years without writing anything down. Because they didn't need to. They had seen her hands, they had heard her voice, they had learned. Or that a baker's widow had once saved an entire street during a famine by baking night and day from a fire that never went out. Children told stories of old women who could bake without fire, whose loaves never burned, who knew secrets from the Roman days. These weren't believed literally, of course, but they spoke to something deeper, a reverence for women who worked in shadows, whose names were not carved in stone, but whose labor filled every stomach in the city. She might not sign the papers, but she gave the orders. Her influence extended far beyond the oven, shaping the family's fortunes through subtle, careful decisions. Not as names in a guild ledger, but as something far more enduring, as warmth, as nourishment, as the humble, necessary rhythm of survival. Their roles shifted with age and need, but the thread of continuity remained. A woman might begin by shaping crusts under her mother's watchful eye, pass through decades of baking for her children, and finally end her life as the voice beside the hearth, trusted, worn, and steady. These transitions were not celebrated. They were simply understood. They were life. Even when not allowed to touch the dough that would be sold, she was responsible for everything surrounding it. Cleaning the benches, maintaining tools, preparing ingredients, and even handling customers while the baker worked in the back. Her labor was constant but invisible. No guild badge would ever be pinned to her apron. No name etched beside the loaves she helped shape. When official bakeries shuttered or reduced output, it was women who quietly opened their homes, baking for the sick, the elderly, or the displaced. These acts of care, though unpaid and unrecorded, prevented deeper hunger and panic. A crust delivered quietly at dusk, a small loaf left on a windowsill, a pot of porridge shared between doorsteps. These gestures stitched the fabric of the community in ways the guild could not. And yet, without her, the shop would fall apart. A woman who helped another during a lean winter would be remembered for it years later, when her own hearth grew cold. Many of these women were not formally literate, yet they possessed encyclopedic memories when it came to ingredients, ratios, and weather patterns. They knew that the flour milled after heavy rain baked differently from that ground during drought. They noticed how a loaf behaved when the wind shifted from the north, or when the smoke from the tanneries grew thick in the streets. Their knowledge came from observation, from touch, from the sounds a loaf made as it cooled. They lacked parchment and ink, but their recipes were no less refined. Instead of measurements, they used metaphors. A poundful, a bowl's worth. The amount that clings to a finger but falls from a spoon. These approximations weren't vague, they were precise in their own way, shaped by generations of trial, failure, and practice. Girls were introduced to this world, young. From the moment they could walk steadily beside their mother's skirts, they were handed scraps of dough to play with, not as toys, but as tools of familiarity. They learned to mix with both hands, to keep time by breath or song, to shape loaves with patterns that marked the house's identity. Some loaves bore crosses, others spirals or dots. In homes where neighbors were fed from the same oven, these markings mattered. They told stories of who baked which loaf, who shared with whom, and who had gone hungry the week before. Marriage often brought further responsibility. A young wife might be expected to manage a household oven, feed a growing family. There were also midwives who baked as a sideline widows who sold bread to supplement their meager income, and elderly women who among the wealthier merchant classes. Some women did gain a different kind of power. In times of crisis, floods, famines, riots, it was often women who stabilized the neighborhood, and they suffered too. A failed bake meant more than wasted flour. It meant explaining to children why supper was thinner that night. Folklore clung to these women. And when one of them died, the absence was felt not in ceremony, but in silence. A neighbor noticed fewer loaves at the market. In every crust torn between siblings, in every slice offered to a stranger, in every quiet morning kneading beside a dim hearth, these women lived on. Chapter 9. The Famine Loaves and Fake Bakers. The bread changed during famine. You could see it before you even touched it. Smaller, darker, often misshapen. In times of hunger, when grain caravans were delayed by war, or floods ruined entire harvests, the loaf itself became a reflection of desperation. In the poorer quarters of Paris, what had once been a heavy comfort now sat on shelves like accusation, cracked crusts, bitter crumbs, strange odors. It wasn't just a matter of taste, it was a matter of trust. Because in times of famine, even the most honest baker might be tempted to stretch the flour just a little further. And when temptation spread, so did deception. They were called famine loaves, and everyone knew them. Some were mixed with ground up peas, which gave a green-gray color to the dough and a sourness to the bite. Others were blended with sawdust, or what was charitably called wood flour, scrapings from old planks sifted fine, then boiled to soften before mixing. Bakers who used such fillers claimed it was better than letting people starve. Perhaps it was. But even then, a loaf made with clay, chalk, or powdered bark could damage more than just a stomach. It could ruin a reputation. Most people ate them anyway. They didn't have a choice. When wheat prices tripled, when rye disappeared from the stalls, when the bakers hung signs announcing half-ration loaves only, the poor lined up regardless. Bread was still bread. Even bad bread filled the emptiness. Parents tore the crusts thinner, let children eat first, and saved the soggy centers for themselves. Hunger dulled the senses. It blurred the difference between a bitter loaf and a foul one, between honest bread and something just barely edible. And when complaints did come, when someone spat out a bite or fell sick, there was no one to blame. The baker had no flour. The miller had no grain. The city had no answer. Famine didn't just alter the bread. It altered the people. Long queues formed before dawn, winding through alleys and market lanes. The air grew tense. A single accusation, he's hiding flour, she baked with spoiled grain, could spark chaos. Bakers who once enjoyed loyal customers found themselves behind bolted shutters, scanning the street before opening their doors. Women clutched coins with shaking hands, begging for an extra crust. Some brought trinkets to trade. Others brought nothing at all, just pleading eyes. It was hard to say no. Harder still when you had your own children to feed. And amid this collapse, the fake bakers appeared. They emerged like weeds in a field left untended. Men and women who had no license, no guild training, and often no oven of their own. Yet somehow they sold loaves in the square. They rented space in disused hearths, repurposed wash basins, or paid a few coins to work at night in abandoned bakehouses. Their bread was quick, cheap, often dangerous. Some sold loaves made mostly of boiled grain husks, hardened in pans. Others molded wet bran into shape with glue made from animal bones, then blackened the crust with soot to pass it off as rye. If caught, they could be fined, whipped, or branded on the hand, but they kept coming. Because in famine, the difference between fake and real narrowed. What mattered most was whether it filled your stomach. Not all of them were malicious. Some were simply desperate. A father with no trade, a widow with no support, an orphan who had watched a baker once and thought he could try. They didn't always understand fermentation. They didn't measure ingredients. Their loaves were inconsistent, but they were trying. Trying to survive, to feed a street, to carve out a place where the city had given none. These bakers knew they were breaking the law. But in their eyes, it wasn't theft. It was necessity. The guild, of course, responded. Inspectors were dispatched more often during famine years. Anyone caught selling bread without the proper markings, weight, shape, signature scoring, was hauled before the council. True bakers were told to report unlicensed ovens. Many did, not out of cruelty, but out of fear. If the fake bakers flourished, their own work might be called into question. If someone fell ill from a false loaf, it could tarnish the reputation of the whole profession. so the guild cracked down. And yet, for every shut-down alley oven, two more sprang up the next week. There were inevitably tragedies. A boy in St. Martin died after eating a loaf made with spoiled bran and lime. A family on the riverbank grew sick from bread baked with ash scraped from tanning vats. One baker, known for mixing powdered chalk into his flour to increase weight, was caught and sentenced to public humiliation. He was paraded through the square with his false loaves hung around his neck, a sign declaring, "I fed lies." The crowd threw spoiled vegetables. Some spat. And yet, after his punishment, he was seen again weeks later, selling biscuits outside the city gate. Hunger did not care about shame. The poor, caught between high prices and dangerous loaves, developed their own tests. They squeezed the bread for bounce. They sniffed the crust for rot. They broke open the center and looked for streaks of white or spots of gray signs of foreign matter. Some swore by touch, claiming they could feel the grain's truth through their fingers. Others watched the seller's face. If the bread was good, they reasoned, the eyes would hold no fear. But desperation clouded judgment, and many chose not to test at all. They took the bread, no matter how it looked, because to hesitate was to lose your place in line. To lose your place was to go hungry. And hunger, as the people of Paris knew all too well, did not wait. The city authorities issued proclamations. They announced efforts to stabilize grain prices, to penalize fraud, to protect the people. But these measures often arrived too late or were unevenly enforced. A nobleman's granary might be spared inspection, while a widow's pantry was overturned. A bribe might secure a delivery or delay an accusation. And so, the system staggered forward uneven, uncertain, sometimes cruel. Yet within that broken framework, bread continued to appear. Not always good, not always honest, but it was there because in Paris, even in its leanest years, people found a way to bake. They baked with what they had. They baked with what they could borrow or steal. They shaped loaves out of things that barely qualify as food. And through it all, they fed one another. They risked punishment. They risked illness. And still they lit the oven. There is something deeply unsettling about the smell of famine bread. It didn't carry the familiar comfort of warm crust or rising yeast. Instead, it brought with it the scent of soot, damp wood, sometimes even rot. Young boys and girls carried sacks of husks or spoiled flour, their hands blackened by ash, their eyes red from smoke. They weren't trained bakers. They had no aprons, no recipes, no guild guidance. A crust from a neighbor, a thin slice from the church kitchen, a half-spoiled loaf from the back of a stall. The bones of Paris, usually hidden beneath layers of cloth and motion, began to show. Street preachers warned of divine punishment. Physicians spoke of humors out of balance. But the bakers said little. They just baked what they could, when they could, and hoped the flour would hold. People remained cautious. They eyed loaves with lingering suspicion. They asked more questions. They felt the crusts twice. Not because they were universally noble or selfless, but because their work was foundational. Loaves began to carry new marks, subtle symbols of endurance. Some were shaped to look like coins, others with 5 slashes for the 5 years of famine. In one quarter, a baker began stamping a tiny flower on every loaf, a quiet message that spring had come again. People noticed. They spoke of it softly. And when the bread tasted as it once had, there was relief. Not jelly, not celebration. Just quiet gratitude, the kind that fills a room like rising heat. The kind that comes from surviving together, no matter how the city changed, how the rulers shifted, how the economy rose or fell, someone had to bake the bread. And so they kept baking, sometimes with guilt, sometimes with pride, sometimes just because there was nothing else to do. Their ovens burned through frost and fear. Their dough rose slowly, stubbornly, like the city itself. The city's relationship with its bakers had been strained, stretched thin like a dough rolled too many times. It would take seasons to recover. For some, the memory of fake loaves and chalky crumbs would never fully fade. It would surface during the next shortage, the next lean week, the next hard winter. Inside their shops, the usual rhythm of shaping and baking was interrupted by uncertainty. Would the grain shipment arrive? Would the oven hold another week? Would today's loaves be enough to pay the rent, the taxes, the wood supplier? These pieces were soaked in broth, mashed into porridge, or fried with old lard if any could be found. Children were taught how to soften dry bread with hot water, to scrape off mold, to chew slowly. Bread was no longer a centerpiece. It became an ingredient, a base, a vessel, and still it was revered. No crumb was wasted. No loaf was thrown out unless it was completely inedible. And even then, parts of it might be dried and ground in meal to be reused again. But they learned quickly how to press dough into shape, how to mimic the scoring of legal loaves, how to avoid the gaze of inspectors. At night, when the ovens cooled and the streets grew quiet, these makeshift workers would return to crowded homes with a crust or two hidden beneath their tunics, crumbs falling into their laps as they drifted into sleep. Others sold their tools for coin or pawned their flour for a day's meat. The people expected it. They lined up for it. They prayed over it. In a city where wine could disappear and meat could vanish from markets for weeks, bread remained. Even in its most dishonest form, even when mixed with chalk, ash, or powdered weeds, it was still called bread. It still bore the shape, the purpose, the memory. It connected the city to itself. A loaf passed from hand to hand in the dim light of morning carried more than calories. It carried hope and defiance. A few joined the very ranks of the fake bakers they once condemned, forced by desperation to bake in alleys and sell loaves with no markings. Their pride faded slowly, replaced by the blank routine of survival. They no longer shaped their crust with care. They no longer blessed the dough with a cross before baking. They just worked quietly until they couldn't anymore. Those who lived through the worst years of scarcity remembered that smell for decades. It clung to the edges of memory, rising unbidden whenever hunger returned. Some guild bakers, despite the risks, quietly distributed their surplus to those in need. At closing time, they left misshapen loaves beside doorways or under empty carts. These weren't perfect breads. They were underbaked, slightly burned or miscored, but they were edible. A few even kept a small famine batch in reserve. Loaves made intentionally coarse and dense, sold for half price or given away under the guise of animal feed. It was a dangerous practice, one that could draw the ire of inspectors or competitors, but they did it anyway. Not because they were saints, but because they understood. They'd seen hunger's face. They'd felt the ache in their own bellies once. Unlike the bread of feast days, golden, round, dotted with herbs, famine loaves were flat, gray, often cracked open like dried clay. They baked faster, used less fuel, and cooled too quickly. They were not meant to nourish. They were meant to prevent collapse. Some of the city's poorest residents found work shaping these loaves, hired by under-the-table operations that sprang up in abandoned buildings or the shadowed corners of the riverbank. And yet, amid all this hardship and deception, there were moments of remarkable kindness. For many households, survival depended on combining whatever scraps could be gathered. As famine stretched across seasons, the physical signs of hunger grew visible. People thinned. Eyes sank. Fingers trembled. Some bakers gave up entirely. Their shops closed. Their ovens went cold. And yet bread never disappeared completely. It lingered. It limped. It returned, even in its worst form, because it had to, when the worst of the famine lifted, when caravans returned. Harvests improved and the price of flour dipped again. Things did not immediately return to normal. But the bakers endured. And in that slow return to form, a different kind of bread emerged, not just from flour and yeast, but from memory. Chapter 10: Punishments in the Public Square. There was something uniquely humiliating about punishment in the public square. Not the pain of it necessarily, though pain was often involved, but the deliberate staging. The way your mistake, once private, became everyone's business. In medieval Paris, the public square was not just a place to buy bread or hear news. It was a theater of shame. And the bakers, those seemingly humble providers of daily sustenance, were not exempt from its harsh spotlight. In fact, they often found themselves center stage. Bread was too important, too symbolic, too tightly woven into the fabric of city life to be treated casually. And so, when a baker cheated, lied, or simply failed, the consequences had to be public. A burnt loaf might not seem like a serious offense today, but in a society where food shortages were common and trust in the guild system, fragile, a single bad bake could be interpreted as negligence, greed, or even treason. After all, bread was not just sustenance, it was obligation. And when that obligation was broken, the city demanded a reckoning. The most common punishment was the bread parade. It sounds almost celebratory, but it was far from it. A baker who had underweighted his loaves, used spoiled grain, or baked in an unlicensed oven could be stripped to his undershirt, tied to a cart, and paraded through the streets. Around his neck, loaves of his own bad bread were hung on strings, sometimes so many that the weight dragged on his shoulders. A sign was usually added declaring his crime in large, crude lettering: cheated the people, or sold rotten bread. The crowd, already familiar with the offense through gossip, gathered to watch. Children laughed, housewives scowled. Occasionally, someone would throw a cabbage or a crust of their own. The procession always ended at the square, where the bread would be burned in a public fire, and the offender dismissed with a final blow or a fine. It wasn't always men. While rare, women who ran illegal bakehouses or attempted to pass off fake bread could also be punished. One record tells of a woman named Isolde, who was caught baking with a mixture of ground peas and plaster to increase her loave's weight. She was paraded not with bread, but with a sack of her false flour. At every street corner, she was forced to shout her crime, while an official rang a bell behind her. By the time she reached the central square, her voice was hoarse and her dignity frayed. She was fined heavily, her baking tools seized, and her name recorded in the guild's blacklist. For years after, people referred to her loaves as Isolde's bricks. More serious offenses like repeated fraud, selling poisoned bread, or defying the guild could result in harsher punishments. Some bakers were locked in stocks, left for hours or days while townsfolk mocked or scolded them. Others were whipped, though rarely to the point of serious injury. The point was not destruction, it was deterrence. The city needed its bakers, but it needed them honest. And so, rather than eliminate the offender, the authorities chose to humiliate them, to stain their reputation so thoroughly that they never dare misstep again. There was a strange ceremony to it all. Before a public punishment, a bell would ring through the neighborhood, summoning residents. Officials read the charges aloud from a scroll, often with exaggerated flair. Sometimes the bad bread itself was displayed blackened crusts, undercooked middles, loaves crumbling from too much ash or too little flour. The visual evidence stirred anger, especially among the poor who had paid good coin for those crumbs. The baker stood beside his work, head lowered, as the accusations piled up. He was not allowed to speak. His silence was part of the performance. And yet, not all who faced public punishment were guilty in the way the crowd believed. In some cases, bakers were targeted unfairly. A batch could be spoiled by bad grain from the miller, or the fire might burn too hot through no fault of the baker. Sometimes the inspectors were corrupt, demanding bribes or singling out individuals with whom they held personal grudges. But once the charges were read, the punishment followed. This system left little room for nuance. A bad loaf was a bad loaf, and the people demanded justice, not explanation. Some punishments were more symbolic, in a practice known as the empty shelf. A baker found guilty of repeated offenses would have his stall stripped bare and left open for a day with a single broken loaf displayed under glass. A sign beside it read, "What happens when trust is broken?" Customers were invited to walk by, look, and reflect. The shame of that display, the quiet derision of passers-by, cut deeper than any whip. The baker was allowed to resume business the next day, but the memory lingered. Some shops never recovered. There were also the punishments that lived only in rumor. Stories told in hushed tones about bakers who had been sent to the countryside in disgrace, forbidden to bake within the city walls again. Tales of a baker who once baked his own punishment loaf, dense, bitter, and forced to eat it in front of the crowd. Whether true or not, such tales reinforced the stakes. They kept younger bakers cautious, apprentices watchful, and the guild's authority intact. For all its cruelty, the punishment system did serve a purpose. It reinforced the sacredness of bread, the idea that every loaf mattered. It reminded both bakers and buyers that food was a contract, and that to break that contract even once was to invite the weight of the whole city upon your shoulders. But there were quieter consequences too. A punished baker, even after serving his time, often found his customers hesitant. People remembered. They spoke in half sentences. "Isn't that the man who, uh, uh, t- uh, um, uh." It could take years to rebuild a reputation. Some never did. Others leaned into it, renaming their shops with winking irony. One baker who had been punished for underweight loaves reopened as the honest crust. Another, accused of using old flour, hung a sign that read, "Fresh enough to fear inspection." These gestures didn't erase the past, but they softened it. They invited laughter instead of scorn. Sometimes that was enough. In this delicate dance between trust and punishment, between performance and penance, the city maintained its balance. Bread remained sacred, bakers remained watchful, and in the public square, where justice played out not in silence but in spectacle, the rhythm of accountability continued. Not fair, not always kind, but clear and known. Not all punishments for bakers in medieval Paris unfolded with bells and banners. Some arrived quietly, in the way customers began walking a little further to the next shop, in the way a landlord stopped extending credit, or the wood supplier increased his price by a few extra sous, claiming risk fees. Social punishments, though not recorded in court ledgers, could be even more crippling than formal sanctions. A baker lived and died by reputation. Flour could be purchased, firewood could be begged or borrowed. But once trust had burned down, no amount of coin could rebuild it quickly. A single accusation, even if never proven, could tarnish an entire household for seasons. Among guild members, punishment could take the form of internal rebuke. During regular meetings, especially after a scandal or public incident, the guild might call forward the offender in front of his peers, not in front of a crowd, but in a vaulted hall that echoed every word. The baker would be asked to explain, to account for his flour weights, his fuel purchases, the inconsistency of his batches. These hearings were not loud, but they were heavy. A man could feel centuries of tradition hanging behind every question. If his answers displeased the masters, he might be suspended from selling for a week, barred from apprenticeships, or ordered to pay a steep fine into the communal fund that helped support widows and injured guild members. Some guilds maintained a book of shame, a large ledger where the names of those fined, suspended or caught cheating, were recorded in red ink. The entries were spare: name, offense, date, penalty. But they carried weight. Apprentices were warned never to forget the names listed there. Some shops even displayed copies near their doors, a gesture of transparency to customers. It was a warning, but also a shield. "You will not find my name here," it said, without saying anything at all. Occasionally, entire families bore the weight of punishment. A baker's wife, who helped run the shop, might find her own market dealings soured by the news of her husband's offense. A son apprenticed in another ward could be dismissed purely due to association. In a world so dependent on word of mouth and inherited status, guilt could spread like flour in the air clinging, subtle, persistent. Even the children of a disgraced baker might be denied entry into the guild, unless they changed their surname or moved to another city entirely. Despite this, some punished bakers found unusual paths to redemption. A few, after serving public penance, became advocates for reform within the guild, suggesting clearer rules for flour quality, or pushing for better oversight of millers, whom many believed to be the root of more problems than the bakers themselves. One particularly infamous case involved a man named Aling, who, after being paraded for mixing old grain into his dough, returned to the trade years later with a new commitment to transparency. He installed a small weighing table in front of his shop, inviting customers to check their loaves before purchase. Over time, his shop became known as the Scales of St. Denis, and his reputation recovered not in spite of the punishment, but because of how he responded to it. Others chose to vanish from the baking world altogether. Some took up work as porters, others as grain haulers or tavern cooks where their skills in dough. And fire could be applied to less scrutinized tasks like pies or flatbreads. One man became a night watch torchbearer, saying he preferred the clarity of firelight to the shadowed heat of ovens. They carried their memories of punishment with them, sometimes bitter, sometimes oddly proud. For even disgrace could be proof of belonging. Only those inside the profession could be punished by it. And still, the rituals of punishment remained a part of the city's rhythm. They did not occur daily or even weekly, but their presence hovered over every baking shift. A baker kneading dough at dawn remembered the man who had been lashed for using pond water. A mother teaching her son to sweep the hearth reminded him of the fines for leaving soot in the oven's mouth. A young apprentice learning to score a loaf was told to make the marks clean, not just for beauty, but to avoid suspicion. The city remembered its lessons aloud, passing them down not as warnings, but as stories. In some quarters, punishment inspired a kind of gallows humor. Jokes circulated among apprentices, dark, dry, and always whispered. Better to burn your crust than burn your name. Measure your flour or measure your steps to the pillory. Even the guild elders, severe as they were, sometimes smiled at such remarks, knowing full well that fear alone did not maintain discipline. Fear faded. It was culture, habit, and memory that kept standards intact. Interestingly, the public also played a role in calibrating the harshness of punishment. During some bread shortages, when bakers were doing all they could with poor supplies, the crowds were less eager to jeer at a public shaming. They knew the problem ran deeper than a single man's error. In those moments, punishments became more symbolic than scornful. A quiet parade, fewer vegetables thrown, a shorter sentence in the stocks. The line between justice and scapegoating was thin, and the people, hungry as they often were, sensed it. Punishment also revealed the fragility of the system. For every baker exposed and reprimanded, there were dozens more walking the line between honesty and survival. The city could not afford to lose them all. It was a balancing act punish, just enough to reassure the public, but not so much as to cause a shortage. And so some offenses were quietly overlooked. A small weight discrepancy, a loaf baked a bit too early, an unlicensed nephew helping in the back room. These were ignored in good times, scrutinized in bad. Justice was not blind in Paris. It was busy, biased, and painfully aware of the bread supply. Yet in all this complexity, the role of punishment served its core purpose to remind the baker and everyone else that bread was sacred. Not in a mystical sense, but in a civic one. Bread held the city together. And when something held that much weight, it had to be protected, even if that meant dragging a man through the streets with loaves tied to his neck. As the sun dipped behind the rooftops of Paris and the scent of bread cooled in the cobbled lanes, the day's mistakes were carried quietly home. Bakers locked their doors. The city exhaled. And though most ovens would light again tomorrow with the same mixture of hope and worry, every baker knew that just one misstep could bring them back to the square and to the crowd's gaze beneath the swinging sign of justice with the bread. They baked hung not on shelves, but on themselves. Chapter 11. Saint Honor and the Blessing of the Dough. Each spring, as Paris shook off the chill of winter and the river banks softened under the warmth of a lengthening sun, something quiet and sacred stirred within the bakeries. It wasn't tied to quotas or punishments, nor to market rhythms or guild meetings. It was older, more intimate, and in many ways more enduring than the regulations and fines that shaped the rest of the year. It was the feast of Saint Honor, patron saint of bakers, protector of dough, flour, and fire. Some were adorned with simple patterns of grain pressed into the crust before baking, others with intricate braids or crosses made from dough. These feast loaves were often not sold, but given away delivered to monasteries, orphanages, and the homes of widows who could no longer stand in line at the bakery door. Children received sweetened rolls dusted with sugar or dried fruit, rare indulgences carved from the same flour they had watched being blessed that morning. Children clapped. Women tossed small coins toward the procession, which would be collected later and donated to the city's hospitals. There, a long wooden table would be set with a modest meal. Bread, of course, but also cheese, salted fish, and a stew made from lentils or cabbage. A city that demanded so much speed, precision. Obedience paused for one day to remember the human heart beating beneath the crust. For just a few hours, the mistakes and punishments, the shortages and riots receded. And what remained was simple: flour, fire, and fellowship. No wine, only water or small beer. The talk was soft. They compared flour qualities, shared techniques, sometimes told stories of customers who had made them laugh or cry. There was no formal agenda. Only the warm presence of people who knew, without saying it, what it meant to wake before dawn and carry heat through the darkness. To shape something with your hands and send it out into the world, knowing it would be torn, chewed, swallowed, and forgotten before the sun rose again. It was one of the few days when bakers were seen not just as tradesmen, but as guardians of something deeper, sustainers, craftsmen, quiet servants of the city's daily survival. Other years, it was simply the elder of the guild who stood and raised a crust in honor of Saint Honor. He would speak the same simple line year after year. We rise as the dough does, not for ourselves, but for those who eat. The others would nod, sometimes murmur a prayer, sometimes say nothing at all. Then the food was eaten, and the hall slowly emptied, one baker at a time, heading back to homes above the shop or cottages near the edge of the river. The night passed without fanfare, and for that brief walk through the winding lanes of Paris, they stood a little straighter. And for just one day each year, the city's bakers paused not to defend their honor, but to celebrate it. If a baker had argued with a neighbor, cheated a rival, or fallen out with an old friend over guild politics, this was the day to set it right. A loaf, warm, uncut, marked with 3 slashes, would be wrapped in cloth and left on the doorstep of the offended party. No note, no name, only the bread. If it was accepted, the conflict was considered closed. If it remained on the step the next morning, the matter would have to wait until next year. Unlike the harsher spectacles of public punishment or the anxious bustle of famine baking, this was a time of gentle preparation and reverent ritual. On the feast of Saint Honor, the senior members of the bakers' guild would don their formal robes, long tunics of indigo and cream, embroidered at the hems with golden stalks of wheat, and process through the streets in a slow, deliberate walk. They carried a carved wooden statue of the saint, small enough to rest on a board held by 2 men, and stopped at each of the oldest bakehouses in the district. At each stop, the statue was briefly placed on the work table, where the oldest active baker would kiss the hem of the robe and speak a few words of thanks. These were not grand speeches, but humble murmurings grateful for the year's work, for the warmth of the oven, for the fact that the dough still rose. The feast day fell in mid-May, when grain had begun to grow tall, but harvest was still weeks away. It marked a midpoint between scarcity and plenty, between fear and faith. Bakers, young and old, rose earlier than usual on that morning. Before the ovens were lit, before the first dough was folded, they gathered flour in wooden bowls and carried it not to their work tables, but to the small parish chapels that dotted each district. There, in the dim glow of stained glass and beeswax candles, they presented it for blessing. The ritual varied slightly by ward. In some quarters, a priest would touch the flour 3 times with the base of a silver cross. In others, the dough itself was brought unleavened, still sticky, shaped into the round mark of St. Honor's emblem, a bishop's mitre surrounded by a wreath of grain. The air inside these chapels was thick with the scent of incense and flour dust, mingling into something ancient. The prayers were quiet, half-chanted, and always in Latin. Most bakers didn't understand the words fully, but they listened, heads bowed, hands still smelling of yeast and ash. It wasn't about the meaning of the prayer. It was about its rhythm, its constancy, a soft reminder that even the most practical work held something sacred within it. After the blessing, bakers returned to their shops to begin the day's labor, but with a lighter step. Loaves shaped that day bore extra care. One tradition, kept quietly in several neighborhoods, involved the secret gifting of a loaf of forgiveness. The guild also played its part. Apprentices followed behind, carrying baskets of bread to be given to onlookers. At sunset, when the last loaves had cooled and the shops had closed, many bakers gathered together, not in their homes, but in the small halls behind the guild chapel. Some years, a visiting monk or bishop would attend the evening gathering and offer a blessing. And yet there was something profoundly restful in this rhythm. The feast of Saint Honor was also a time when the boundaries between the sacred and the domestic blurred. In the quiet back streets of Paris, women who rarely entered churches or guild halls still lit candles near their hearths that morning, whispering their own prayers over the bread they prepared for family. A grandmother might give a small lump of risen dough to a granddaughter and explain softly how it should feel beneath the palms, how to know when it had come alive. It wasn't about measurements or recipes, but sensation. These loaves were placed on small shelves above the hearth, where they stayed until